message.
Oh, that's okay. We're going to start with the
He has to come. He needs to come.
IDF oral history. And we've got, introduce yourself.
I'm Jen Teaji. I'm the executive director of
Person the
IDF.
camera's pointing at. Let's see, I'm going to try this again.
Oh, that's really creepy.
Yeah, so I'm Jeff, and that's way too close to be doing that. I'm Jeff, and I'm the one filming this, who's really close in the camera now.
I'm Joe. I'm currently the moderator of the board of directors of IDF.
And then we've got Jim over here, who I can't see until I flip this over. Okay. And I think
Subject.
this session, Jim, and I brought my notes. I almost forgot my notes, but I brought my notes.
Good.
After the last session where we went through most of the 70s, and we kind of ended off in the early 80s with the before Sanctuary, but we ended off with kind of the neighborhood fellowship, neighborhood service ministry stuff. And then out of some of the questions that we had, Jim had some follow-up thoughts. And I printed those out in case you didn't remember what you sent me.
That's good.
And and then Jim said he had some more thoughts. We thought we would go back because there's no reason that we have to be necessarily linear. I mean, we're working towards that way. And also, I wanted to see if we could get Naaman to be part of the sanctuary one. For some reason, this looks quicker.
And were you successful?
In what?
Naaman is.
Well, he's not going to be at this one,
He's out of town until
Oh, he's
mid-July.
so he couldn't be at this one.
So we're.
But if we get into some of that today, we'll see. If not, that's okay. So where do you want to start, Jim? Do you want me to start with with these things?
Yeah, why don't you raise your questions and that'll refresh my mind maybe.
Well, I don't remember what the questions were because you didn't raise what the questions were. You just raised what your answers were to my questions. And I felt my questions had been partially answered. But I think most of them here are in response to the IDF-UCF relationship. Because I remember I was asking, just questions about when were things done as UCF, when were things done as IDF. And so I'll just read your answers, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the question was how the IDF-UCF relationship worked with regard to the neighborhood service ministries. I think that was where, because that to me seemed like it was clearly IDF doing it, but it was still UCF. So you said in the 60s, the UCF comedy, is that the correct pronunciation? Comedy?
Right.
Comedy. Comedy agreement was to PR identity as UCF at IDF, UCF at Wesley, UCF at UCC, etc. After the collapse of UCF began, the comedy agreement was IDF, a UCF ministry in the Northwest U of I campus, Community United Church, and ministries of the UCF, etc. These differentiations reflected the confusion or anonymity of UCF as well as the competitive edges of advantage each UCF unit was developing. What I wanted to do was emphasize the organic union, at least solidarity with the other UCF units, despite the fact that we were all moving into life and work modes. During the 60s, I was committed hook, line, and sinker to the organic union agenda of UCF via faith and order processes. Strictly speaking, the ecclesiastical agenda of mainline denominations circling their wagons as the U.S. moved into a post-industrial and postmodern era. UCF united campus ministries throughout the country, but especially here in Illinois and in New York, were among the first to hit the fault lines in this agenda. They were among the first to break away from the mainline strategy of organic union. But I must confess that it was a difficult decision to move outside this camp, and it was an anomic time. And so that's probably one specific answer. There's another part here. So I don't know, did you want to comment more on that, or does that make sense to everybody?
Yeah.
Do people remember the
May I ask what comedy means in this context?
COMITY?
It's an ecclesiastical term that's used to describe treaties or commitments
Okay.
that are institutionally based. And it requires an institution to make those agreements.
Okay.
So you can be in comedy with somebody.
Right.
Let's just make sure we're talking about comedy.
Yeah, not
Not
COM.
Not the ha-ha comedy.
Yeah, Robin Williams comedy.
No, it's spelled differently.
I assumed it was different when I just.
Although most of them are comical.
Quite ironic.
Well, so this followed up. What you had talked about last session was kind of the disintegration of UCF. And I guess what this really highlighted was the flip of how, it's kind of like the struggle we've had for years here, but to say, PRC, a program of the IDF, which is usually no struggle, but it's the food co-op a program of the IDF. That was always the struggle, or things like that. So that's kind of how the UCF moved near the end. It was more like an affiliation as opposed to a major.
Right, and our program guidelines that the program had to meet in order to become a program of IDF were similar to the same kinds of agreements.
So should I move into the next question,
Sure.
answer thing?
Well, one other addition,
Sure.
that collapse of UCF was, it was moving from, it stopped its commitment to a united ministry, ceased shortly after '68, and moved towards a federation, like the Federation of the States in the United States, with each one of the states claiming superiority or supremacy over its matters. And they would only come together on a united basis when there was some emergency
That was the later
that
shift, you said.
involved all of the continued existence of those federated units. Is that, I guess that's a political explanation.
Yeah.
No, that makes sense.
Well, the next question I think had to go, because I think I remember asking about how many IDF and how active the board was in the neighborhood services ministries, trying to figure out. Because I know you had mentioned some specific people and things like that. So your answer then, about wondering about IDF board members, their relationship to IDF activities. By 1970, we had developed a working board, i.e. the board met regularly and its members were active partners in IDF policy formulation. If we had failed at this point, UPCC would have taken control. 3 board members served on each of the board's committees. Board members worked in more than one NSM activity, e.g. the emergency van service drivers numbered 5 board members, 2 staff, and 10 to 15 students. We all had to pass the Illinois truck driver's test, and IDF had to foot the appropriate liability insurance. This number was required in order to cover the calls for emergency service need. I took night shifts, as did Martha and Glenn. The food co-op was another example of 3 board members and 2 staff managing the co-op for the first 5 years. In the first generation, 5 years, we had 6 teams of 10 students each working 3 daily shifts, Friday and Saturday, and a food co-op membership of 1,000 plus each year. I think nearly all board members were engaged in the crime prevention element of the NSM, certainly at the monthly neighborhood meetings, trainings, and preparations. They would wear their whistle-stop whistles around their necks wherever I would find them in UC. And you have to run off to the dentist now. Oh, that's probably not.
Yes.
But, so I guess that was a follow-up just to how active. So it's pretty clear that all the neighborhood service ministry stuff, that the IDF board was intrinsically involved in all of it.
So this was the start of a really activist board at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Up until that time, the board had been, there was a distance between the board and the programs.
Now, is this something you engendered, or is it something that they wanted to do? Did you say, I need help, I need you to do this, or did they say,
It was all of those. It was important to me for that to occur because as long as that distance existed, I was the point between the two. And so when people in the programs were asking what the board was going to support, I was expected to be able to answer that, but without the board's involvement, I couldn't answer it. And when the programs got themselves in trouble, the board held me responsible, which was appropriate. But it meant that I was on the hot seat in front of the board. If the program did something that the board didn't like, then I was the one who was going to get fired. So it was important that these things get together. So I began to work towards.
does that mean new board members, or did that mean just changing somehow some of the board members?
It meant changing some of the board members.
So you mean recruiting board members at this point, or changing some of their minds, or?
Well, if I could
Combination.
change their minds, I would, but it
Okay.
also meant when I couldn't, I would get rid of the board member. Remember I said earlier that no one on the board wanted to serve on the nominating committee for new board members. That was because we had that gigantic board of 47 some odd board members, which meant that I had to go to each one of the districts to recruit board members.
But that was over by this time, right?
Not until '68.
Okay, but by the time the neighborhood
Right.
service ministry came,
Yeah.
that was over.
Yes, that was over.
And we were down to like an 18-person board or so
right,
at that
right.
point.
So in that transition, those 18 board members were open to being programmatic people as well as board members. And they certainly wanted to be involved in the policy formulation, because up until that, there was no policy formulation by the board other than tradition, which, in my way of thinking, was pretty bad, pretty poor. It wasn't bad, it was just pretty poor.
Mhm.
Do you want me to go into some more UCF thoughts that you had?
Whatever.
Okay. So you had more thought this in relation to the other stuff about IDF-UCF relationship during the 70s, especially in regard to UCF activities and IDF's relation to them. Because that was kind of the whole question of what were IDFs, what were UCFs. So after 1971-72, the UCF board achieved some stabilization by the Church of the Brethren on North Neal Street, and Mennonite congregation jumping up with it. McKinley Foundation had pulled out by then, and these two congregations helped UCF maintain a visible and valid ecumenical presence on campus. Both brought certain strengths to us. The Brethren campus minister, Marion Pittman, and her bishop, the Mennonites campus minister, Mark Nation, and a lay person from the local congregation. And they both brought money, something UCF needed after McKinley left and IUMHE funding fell off. Reverend Linda Kuhn was hired as director. Her special interest was womanist theology, the most radical religious feminist theology of the time. The remaining staff members of the original UCF group, the UCF board, and Kuhn served as UCF's brawn and brain for several years. I'm not sure how the others incorporated UCF activities into the work of their separate units, but IDF continued to participate fully in UCF's deliberations, financial support, and activities. These were no longer guided by faith and order processes. Life and work cooperative guidelines had become the strategic norm. We will do nothing separately that we can do together. E.g., the Neighborhood Service Ministry of IDF was separate because of its geographical location in relation to that of the other UCF member units. However, the other units, 1, shared the names and addresses of their members who lived within IDF's self-defined neighborhood, 2, encouraged their members to participate in IDF's NSM, and 3, so blessed, many did just that. For example, UCF's ministry with women was included in IDF's work. 1, the Witches' Sister celebrations in the Garth in the Chapel. 2, I served on the Baker Fund Board. And 3, IDF initiated the Religious Committee for the ERA for winning hearts and minds of religious women and men in Champaign County for support of the ERA, and UCF, its member units, participated in that effort, providing leadership and money. There was, however, a fatal weakness: local congregations like the Church of the Brethren and the Mennonites. The ministry with women was not appreciated by many, especially the witches, and ERA was actively opposed by the Eagle Forum and every congregation in town. Then the unthinkable happened. The Wesley congregation, UPCC, and the Community United Church applied for UCF membership. And those of us who believed this would be the death knell for UCF were outvoted within the UCF board. Linda Kuhn resigned shortly thereafter. The ministry with women was discontinued, and I was not reelected to the Baker Fund board. Senior pastors became the dominant viewpoint, and campus ministers were reduced to field hands. Marion Pittman was shipped off to Arizona, and Mark Nation left town to do doctoral studies. UCF had only one more battle left: peacemaking and the study of militarization of higher education, 1979 to 1980. It was the brainchild of Ron Markin, Adkins, and me. But once Wesley pulled out, spring of 1980, and UCC's proposed dissolution, and the UCC's proposed dissolution, there was no life left in us to fight. Ron and I closed out UCF legal affairs in June and July 1980. So UPCC and Community United Church and Wesley tried to do an end run kind of thing. If we can't change it, we'll become part of it. When UPCC was conservative, how about Wesley and UCC? I thought they were a little more progressive.
Wesley had a new staff by that time. All of the old staff that had been part of UCF had been either fired or left for better opportunities. And they had a whole new staff over there. And they were more interested in, and also the bishop of the Central Conference had changed. And the bishop, the Methodist bishop, reasserted his control over Wesley.
Oh, it's the congregation, because the foundation was already part of it.
Mm-hmm.
It was the congregation,
Right, congregation
becoming
came
part
on.
of it.
And so, and I didn't bring that. Well, in an interview with the pastor at Wesley Church and Foundation, he made it pretty clear that the only thing that was going to unite Wesley to UCF was if it was in its economic advantage to do so. And he was explicit about that. Economics was the priority that he was giving. And since Wesley was putting money into UCF, and UCF was not returning any financial benefit to Wesley, he didn't see any need for it to continue.
Such as members?
Such as money. He was very clear it had to do
But
with
members
money.
who gave money, like, so you want a new parishioner or something?
I'm sure that might have had some impact, but I think his really intention was to pull out of UCF.
I mean, UCF never made money anyway, right?
No, no, it was, it was a beggar. It was on the street holding out a tin cup and occasionally doing a dance. And hoping somebody put money in. So that was his, and finally, in January of that year, they decided to pull out.
So no congregations had ever been part of UCF before
No,
until this
no.
point. So at this point, it's kind of like the perceived parent institution saying, we want to destroy this, but the way to do it is we're going to try and take it over and push everything out.
Right.
Instead of just shutting down the funding.
And the same thing was happening over here, although not that explicitly. There had been two confrontations during the 70s between IDF and UPCC. And it was, despite the fact that Rafe Miller was very supportive, who's pastor of UPCC, was very supportive of IDF, the congregation was pressuring him. I don't know if I recited this story or not, but I think it was in May of 78 or 79, we were fixing to go, Dolores and I were fixing to go on vacation, and Rafe asked me to come in and talk to me for a little bit, and it wasn't so much a dialogue as it was he was telling me that I had to resign, and that if I didn't resign, he was going to be fired, which was interesting. So I told him, well, give me a day to think about it. So I went home, called all the IDF board members. Rafe had indicated that he was under a lot of pressure from people in the congregation. Well, nearly all the board members of IDF were members of UPC at that time. So I called all of them that evening to find out if they were pressuring Rafe on this. And one of them said no, were as surprised about it as I was. So the next day I went back to Rafe and said, look, if somebody's going to resign, it's not going to be me. So then we went on vacation. When I got back, Rafe came and said, you're right, the problem is mine, not yours. So there was a lot of pressure in Uniplace on Rafe to get me out of town.
And this was when? Early 70s?
78 or 79.
Late 70s, okay.
And later,
And what do you think that was based on? The UCF work or the?
I think it was based on that the foundation was doing things that the congregation didn't want to be identified with. Pretty much like the Vineyard Church a month ago was worried that the protesters outside it over the war were going to be identified as speaking for the congregation. They didn't want that. And so I think Uniplace felt that whatever the foundation was doing was being read by the community as programs that the congregation supported and was behind.
But these are programs like, neighborhood service and
The ERA
things-
stuff.
The ERA and, so,
global awareness seminars.
right. So it's not like you're calling for revolution or anything.
Well, some of the global awareness seminars
Well,
probably were.
from their point of view, it probably was.
Yeah.
For example, ERA I'm sure was linked to the move that Rafe had started in the church was to elect some women to the decision-making bodies of the congregation. And so I'm sure they saw the foundation's work in ERA as a way of helping that process. It certainly wasn't our intention to do that, but that was one of the unintentional consequences of being in our ERA. Plus, the opposition in this county to women at that time was unbelievable. When the witches did their dance out there in the north.
May I ask about these witches?
I was going to ask about the witches and the.
Jim talked about it last time.
But the conflict between
remember.
the witches and the
Exactly.
women's ministry.
Yeah.
That
There wasn't a conflict between the two, though.
Well, didn't they? They were opposed to it, right?
Not that.
You said the
that's
witches
something-
were opposed to in one of those answers, I think.
No,
Unless you misread it, Jeff.
unless you misheard
We both
it.
heard the same thing.
No, as I read it, the witches' sister celebration and stuff, and the women's ministry stuff, the Baker Board were opposed by some of these other bodies.
Okay.
Yes. And I
That isn't
was
what
supporting
we heard in
was
the reading.
supporting
Well,
those. That
my
might have been
reading
the
was
way I read it.
flawless. Maybe it was the writing that was to blame.
Maybe it was the writing. The witches, Daly wrote this book about, what was it, God the Father, other things, and moved her off into witchology.
Are we talking like real witches? Like,
They considered themselves to be witches.
It's a
Make sure it
range.
wasn't like
There's
an
also a
acronym for
range.
something or-
There's a ra- no.
But were they a coven? No, they were not a coven. To be a coven in the state of Illinois, you got to be registered as a religious organization given over to witchcraft. The witches, the UCF witches, were women who were trying to say something against male domination of ministerial status. They were the sacred ones.
so not that everyone was sacred, but the women were sacred and men were not, versus the men were sacred and women were not.
Some, I think, felt that. Linda came pretty close to that at times.
Anybody involved in that had
You
been
know
around
these
later?
witches?
Involved.
And the witches thing that stuck around later, that was around.
Yeah.
Like
yeah,
was Jan Kelmar in that, or was that before her time?
That was before Jan. Jan wasn't around at that time.
What about Mary Lee? Was Mary Lee?
But there were a number of Mary Lee, I think was.
Yeah.
Marion Yarber's daughter was. E. Castile played with it for a little bit. So there were a number of, there was another woman that was in IDF whose name I've forgotten. Penny was her first name. But basically they were protesting the absence of women in decision-making roles and power roles in the church ministry.
So we're not talking like putting hexes on people,
I'm sure they did that.
brewing stuff in
I'm
a.
sure if that was a part of their...
That's not really
of
wicked
their-
stuff anyway.
I know, but that's,
See,
That's like TV version of
I
like
know,
witches.
but that's my
This is
version.
probably more.
Well-
This is probably more Wiccan stuff, but with the Christian
Okay.
overtones to it.
Well, there's ways of placing curses on folk, and that got me into trouble once because I placed the curse on a member of any place.
Purposely or by
Yes,
accident?
I'm quite sure it was purposefully.
I didn't know if you
Although
like
I'm not
accidentally
sure
said
if-
something that was interpreted as a curse, or.
Yeah, I'm sure that was.
So you haven't hung out with enough Quakers. Who half of them consider themselves Wiccan.
I'm
When you
keeping my
use the-
comments to myself.
When you use the term "God damn" and you apply it to somebody, "God damn you," that is a curse.
Oh yeah, I forgot the whole origin of like what, why we call them curse words.
So that it's not swearing. It's a curse. And if a
Oh, I
person
curse a lot of people.
to whom you curse believes it curses,
might be in trouble.
they're in trouble.
Interesting. Learned a whole new thing today.
Well, enough about witches.
So we just wanted to get that clarified because, yeah, I had the same.
Someone else will be watching and
I had the
have the
same
same
issue.
question.
I had
You
the
know,
same
I'm
issue.
talking.
Well,
But
Mary
in-
Daly, go read Mary Daly's books, and you'll see what, the witch movement was about.
It was like Gyn ecology, right? Or wasn't that one of them, like
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's written a whole bunch of books.
ecology?
Yeah, Mary
Yeah.
Daly's a.
And after God the Father book, it gets further out to finally, I don't understand it at all, but she did publish a book on witch terminology, so you gotta get that book. Be
It's
able-
like the guide to the book.
Yes, right, yeah.
Okay.
Just thinking.
I mean, that was a whole big strand in the feminist movement in the 70s and 80s, was, and probably still a
Yeah.
sub-strand today, but the whole
My daughter looked
Wiccan
up
thing.
in a lot of.
No, and I
My
have
daughter
one
knows
time
a
or
lot
so.
about that stuff.
So I just never really understood it.
Yeah, well, it was a big thing here. There was a Jewish kid who was really active in the program here, and I met him on Wright Street going up to the library, and it was snowing. It was in the middle of winter, and it was snowing, and this guy was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, kind of looking up at the sky, looking at the snowflakes fall, and he was having a vision.
Sure wasn't just a reaction to the drugs he took?
I don't know what it was, but
Might have helped
Snow in his eyes.
so his first name was Bruce, and so I stopped and talked to him for a little bit, and he invited me to attend a covenant meeting, which was down on First and Springfield, that time behind where that automobile shop is now. There was an apartment house behind, there still is. So I went, and I walked into the room, and there was a bona fide registered witch who was in charge of the service, and nothing was happening. So I was asking Bruce what's going on, and he says, well, he's told us that there are demons hanging from the ceiling of the room in which we were on, and that they're there because I'm there, and that the service wasn't able to continue until I left. So these were true believers. So I left, and they were able to go on with their business.
I do often see demons hanging from the ceiling. But
It kind of reminds me, jumping forward to the Gulf War, when we had the InReach committee that got formed.
Oh,
oh
yeah.
my God.
And then I was the only one brave enough or stupid enough to be forced to attend it. That wasn't one of the people. Because we had too much outreach, we didn't have enough InReach.
And there was the.
That's a spot. Like, I have like 10 jokes in my head already.
The
just
Oh,
saying.
you don't even know the whole
The
story.
in-between committee instead of an executive committee, and all that stuff.
Well, so Jim, is there more stuff that you had thoughts on with the UCF relationship, and I mean, it's plumbed some of the stuff that we were talking about in last session.
Well, that was on the downside. That was a low point.
Which was a low point.
The dissolution of UCF.
Oh.
Low point for me because I had come here because of UCF and its potentiality. So when it began to dissolve and disintegrate, my original purpose for being here was dissolving and disintegrating.
But you helped pull the plug because you didn't want it to become something that it wasn't at the very end.
You didn't really have a choice, though, right?
Yeah, there was nobody else there.
Okay.
So, and that had all started in '68. Wasn't as clear in '68, but it became clear as time went on. And that hinged in with a question that Joe was asking in the last session, but I forget what the question was, Joe.
You did send me some comments on that. Basically, the issue of how all of these things were happening at the same time.
Yeah.
And all of these various experiences were beginning to move you in a certain direction that you didn't plan for, obviously,
Right.
which is what happens to all of us.
Right. And since that email, I was trying to think through
Well, part of it is, I think maybe to help along, part of it seems to be how eventually you moved to this very activist board.
Mhm.
That seemed to be, you know, now we can look back on it as kind of like, almost like a straight line,
Mhm.
you know, from there to the activist board. But what seemed to be happening is all these things that were going on around you and people flying away and all that stuff.
Right.
You begin to, you seem to be taking a hold of the situation and saying, okay, this is what we need to do in order to continue what you wanted, what you came here for, right?
Mhm.
And so the activist board seems to be kind of a logical
Mhm.
endpoint at that point of that story.
I wrote and I found it, and I brought it, an article that the Division of Higher Education asked me to write after 1970, when everything with Kent State, the Jackson State, Nixon's entering of Cambodia, all those things came together. And there was a lot of turmoil here, and for some reason the U of I had become the focal point nationwide as a place where there was going to be major disruptions. So the Division of Higher Education asked me to write an article about it, which I did. And lo and behold, I found a copy of it. And the last part of it is interesting because they were asking me what strategies did the campus ministry here follow in dealing with that. Well, I think I said during that earlier session, oral project, that things were happening so fast that we weren't making good decisions, we weren't strategizing. And so I commented that, you know, there was no strategy that we had. We were lucky to be able to do some things. So you can have a look at that article and see how it ties in with this. But part of it,
When you reread it, did you remember writing that?
yeah.
Okay.
No, I didn't remember it until I found it in the files. I went back through the files looking for things and discovered it. But in '68, that was a turning point for me. And none of the other stuff that happened, I don't think would have happened if I hadn't reached that turning point. Because the board had not yet reached that place where, I mean, it was still distant from the program. And so that gap had to be closed, and that gap wouldn't have closed, I don't think, if I had turned a corner. Now, what was the corner that I seemed to have turned? Well, clearly it was hinged on what was happening in 1970. As I've been thinking about it, it was clearly a part of the stuff that was going on with race relations on campus, with the Summer '64. From my point of view, a tragedy because of what happened to us, as well as the good things that evolved from that. And what was taking place was that Father Pfeiffer got me introduced me to liberation theology. So during that summer of '68, I was beginning to find out about liberation theology. I was moving away from I guess my churchliness. And I found some sermons that I preached that summer, which, looking back over them, what impresses me is that, boy, the biblical idiom that I was using will probably hinder your reading them. But if you will get past that and read between the lines, maybe you'll see what I was wrestling with.
Remember those sermons you delivered at UPCC? Or?
Yeah.
How did they go over?
They didn't.
How often were you presenting sermons at UPCC at this point, during this period?
Well, Rafe was more open than Jack was. Rafe was letting me preach about 6-7 times a year, whereas Jack was probably 2 or 3 times.
Jack.
Jarman.
Jarman.
Once Roger got here, I never preached again. Except maybe once.
What's the quick chronology of UPCC ministers during your time? So when you got here, it was
Jack Jarman up till 65, I think it was, and then right from 65 to 83.
oh, then Roger came on right after that.
Well, he was a year difference.
Okay.
I think Roger came in late 84, 85.
Oh, right in the midst of the sanctuaries.
Yeah. Well, he came in. Yeah, we had already decided to go in the sanctuary. So, and the only tool that I had was the very same tool that I used after 1945. This was the little Bible I carried in my shirt pocket from 1948 till 54. And there's some interesting little tidbits in that. It also was a good piece of protection during knife fights. And this is the Bible that the Ministerial Alliance gave me for the civil rights work in high school. So, you might be interested in seeing those.
Can you actually read that little Bible? Like,
Yes,
how
yes I did.
little is it?
Huh?
Like, is the text really teeny?
Yes, it's real. I couldn't read it now, but I did then. And I read 2 chapters out of it every day.
That's not the whole Bible, is it?
No, it's just the New Testament.
Okay.
This has the whole Bible in it, and I read 2 chapters out of the Old Testament every day. So by the time of the end of 1954, I had read the Bible through 5 or 6 times. So the biblical language was a part of my upbringing, like being an altar boys was a part of yours.
Right.
You know, and whatever you did in your mixed up family.
I didn't really do anything.
So the thing is, then you were beginning to apply this to your, the liberation theology stuff that you were picking up, right?
Mhm.
Because so, what was it? I know you mentioned the father's name that got you involved in liberation. What was the attractive part of it? Because you wouldn't necessarily,
Of
given
liberation
your background
theology.
of liberation theology, well, you wouldn't necessarily, given your background, just jump right into liberation theology.
Well, no,
right?
Jim was already into the Bonhoeffer stuff, which had some connection, right?
Bonhoeffer was
Yeah.
a piece of it, Karl Barth was a piece of it, and liberation theologians credit them with helping them get
Right.
started.
So you were already moving in that.
Nicholas Berchayev, who was a Russian theologian, who was expelled from Russia after Lenin took over.
Do you know how to spell his name? His last name?
Berdyaev, Berchayev.
I got lost after D. B-E-R-D.
Y-E-A-V.
Okay.
Nikolai Alexandrovich Berchayev.
So bits and pieces of what liberation theology was were already part of your
Yeah.
background, right?
Yeah, plus the arguments that I had with Dad over civil rights also helped feed into that. Because what Dad contributed was that I had to come up with alternatives to his reading. And so it was kind of an imaginative thing that I was engaged in very early. And the pastor at First Christian Church helped create some of those images, new images too. Plus, I have a very active imagination, so it was easy to switch gears. And in fact, I have these marvelous dreams. I had a marvelous dream last night of really wild things. So.
Demons hanging?
No, nothing
That's
hanging.
totally nothing.
So liberation theology at this point, just to kind of connect this up, liberation theology seems to be like
It
the
was
logical point
It
that just kind of brought everything together for you.
plucked nerves and things that sounded good, and never wanted to follow.
Yeah.
But throughout most of the 70s, you had no time to really pursue that, correct? Because you were so involved in.
I've always gotten up around 5 o'clock and did readings, so.
So you were able to pursue it even though you were.
I've always had about 2 hours of reading every day. Still do that, but not at 5 o'clock anymore. So anyway, that transition between 68, that is personal transition from 60, not a private one, but I shared, like these sermons, I was sharing this stuff out, hoping I would get some responses, and the responses I was getting was positive from the foundation, largely, the student body largely, not necessarily the board. Negative stuff from the congregation. And as the shift began to occur in UCF, and the pastors of those congregations became more deeply involved, and Jim Prine in what was then IUMHE, negative feedback too. So I was getting feedback, and I was asking for feedback. And feedback was not, on the whole, positive.
Were there any proto-uprisings at this point? Were there any?
That began, yeah, but they weren't called uprisings.
Yeah, but you were also having that sounding board to the people from the foundation who were receptive.
Right. Yeah, all of the photographs of the first generation of the 70s. Some of them. So these are the folk I'm talking about. Some of them. Oh, this is a picture of Dolores when I first met her. And this is a picture of me during my gambling days.
Oh boy. And how did these
His rubber had
how did these two
curtains?
people come together?
My summer had curtains.
Yes, I did.
Oh yeah, it did. We took them down.
And this is one of the beginnings of uprising. That was called Evening Watch.
Evening Watch, that was the name I was trying to remember. I remember, didn't Chuck Seagard used to go to that, right?
Yep. And here's pictures
Oh,
of
there's
my
D.
ordination.
There's D. Castillo.
Wow.
Jen will borrow these to scan then.
Oh, should I just start collecting them?
That's okay, Jim, right?
Here, I guess this was a
It's like everybody went to the same eyeglasses place here. It's like a meeting of the Kennedy.
Was something happening here, or were people dancing? Or is-
The beginning of the neighborhood service ministry was a block dance featuring Medicare 7, 8, or 9
Okay.
down on the parking lot.
Okay.
And with loudspeakers so that everybody in the neighborhood could hear the music and come and dance.
Cool.
And there was lots of food. And it lasted until dark.
Is that Dave Duncan in this?
Yeah, I think so.
In this photo, you remind me of Bill. Look like Bill.
Here.
You got the tie and the glasses and the haircut.
Yeah.
And I'm
This is-
sorry, Jim. I didn't. Things are going
This
too
is
quickly.
ordination.
So this is
the
ordination.
Right.
That's ordination.
Dave Duncan was the
Board moderator.
board moderator when I came on the board.
Yeah, well, that was before.
Why don't you pass those back to Jim and you get the folder that they're in? Next time.
And this is Harvey Lord, when I met him in church camp way back in
Oh, wow.
1952. So he was kind of a liberation theologian. Just
Okay.
got back from the Philippines. That's him next to the guy who left, the Pastor Hayes.
So you were getting early signals of this?
Yeah, oh
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. It wasn't like a, 1968, it just all of a sudden happened.
No, plus, the use of the atomic bomb blew away the modern world for me.
Right.
So that meant all of the religious stuff, the religious ideology, the American dream stuff. Was all
Well, that was
gone.
kind of what I was alluding to in my comments.
All that was
you
gone.
referred to, that you had that event, and then you had this continuing series of events that just pushed you in a direction that you ended up at. But when you look back on it, and I'm saying this because I'm old now too, and I can think, you can see these signposts, you can see these things that happen in your life that take you in a certain direction.
Mhm.
You just don't See,
No,
at the time, yeah.
The
Yeah.
only
That was
piece
kind
of-
of what I was talking about.
The only piece of, in the rubble after 45 that I could hang on to was this.
Was that, yeah.
So that's why my language in these sermons becomes, I mean, it's a biblical idiom. And it gives problems, all kinds of problems for people today. But they've never been problematic for me.
Mm.
Because I was,
That was your language.
yeah.
I think it's amazing that you still have copies of them.
Oh, well, they were life-saving things, and I saved them, because they were life-saving. And people, part of the reason why I think people at school did not come down on us when we were doing all this gambling stuff was because I had this Bible in my shirt.
I'm not surprised you said that as much as the sermons. I was amazed that you were able to find and keep the sermons all those years.
Oh, I've got sermons all over the place. I just never used them more than once. So they got,
You didn't do a greatest hits one every once in a while?
no, I've never done that. I've never repeated a sermon.
I can make a book for you of the greatest hits.
Yeah, I guess.
And you can have someone like famous narrate it or read
There you
it.
go, yeah. Complete CD collection.
So those are all flashback things. I didn't pass this one. This is the 1970 thing on the crisis.
Oh, and this was for the Board of Education?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
the telegrams they sent me. Here's the initial thing about the Neighborhood Service Ministry.
Jen can scan all these too, so we can.
Be careful with this one, this is on.
He's already done some stuff on
I
typing
didn't scan
paper.
paper.
Yeah, I did some very
These are
fine work.
later things.
Not my work was fine.
And these are the copies of the sermons.
When did she go from Jessup to Brownfield?
Oh,
Judy-
she got married somewhere
Okay.
in there,
Yeah, because when I knew it was Jessup, so it was her
much
dad.
to my dismay. Things deteriorated after that.
After she got married or after she got hired?
Well, they were deteriorating when she got hired, at least for me, and Warren Royer. And Judy was on the job maybe 2 or 3 months, and complaints began to come in.
Now, Jim, you've not talked about the Joyful Noise Singers yet. I see that's part of the Neighborhood Service Ministry.
Yeah, we had joyful singers.
Copy of that too. That piece you wrote on
Oh, yeah.
the events in 1970, that would have been interesting for students to have this past spring as a report from the street, so to speak.
I'm gonna have to actually read those. I started reading the first paragraph of each one, and I was like, oh, I have reading to do.
Audrey, have you had the same number since 1970, the same phone number?
Yep.
No wonder I can remember it. If I didn't know.
I've had it ever since we moved here.
Telegrams. There's a thing called telegrams.
Jim's not talking because everybody's looking at pieces of paper.
Thank you, Joe, for filling in the audio track there. So, well, afterwards, Jen can take those to scan, but I want to take pictures of the Bibles,
Okay.
large and small. There's a good Lewis Blacks that you'll have to hear on the Old Testament and the New Testament, talking
Is
about
this
how,
the Carnegie Hall?
yeah, talking about, it's like, because he's Jewish, and talking about,
Yeah.
well, that's our book, and what do they know about our book, and
Right,
they have their
right,
book, and
Right. Well, that's a big contention throughout Christendom, the history of Christendom. And the basic Jewish critique of Christianity, which I always enjoy reciting to pastors, Christian pastors, the Jewish critique from the 2nd century on was, okay, if the Son of God, if the Messiah has come, why isn't the kingdom of God present? And that usually shuts pastors up. Or they'll go off into this mysterious thing about the second coming.
Jim, I don't want to arbitrarily curtail this or anything like that. So we're probably at a natural point now to move forward, right? I mean,
Fine.
if you want, I mean, we can still
No,
flash
that's
back
fine.
some more.
No, that's fine.
I mean, I don't want to schedule this all around like name and participation, and we can come back to some of the sanctuary stuff too. But I mean, so we kind of. Oh, go ahead, Jim.
I was like, we were like a 5-minute break at some point.
Sure, do you need that ready?
Sure.
Do you want it now?
Or I can just go to the bathroom while you guys keep
Oh,
talking.
we can take a break. I'll take a break.
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 About these issues that I don't remember being discussed in my Catholic upbringing, but there was so that just
What, when you were going to Catholic school, they didn't talk about communism in the Bible?
they didn't talk about these issues in the way that this author did, at least. And so that that there are those steps that kind of your political activism can somehow take you into these different areas that bring you back to where you were, and to some extent.
The other thing on the side of that is that while you can find these threads that sort of run through, you'll also find, going right along with them, are the contradictions.
Oh yeah. No, that was certainly clear.
So there's this dialogue that goes on between these threads and the contradiction. They're both threads, and you have to deal with those. And
It's a dialectical process, right? So, okay,
Well, so-
I'm done.
So in the last section, where we kind of ended off, was with the table fellowships and talking about the nuclear freeze movement. So we kind of talked about the table fellowship, and then I think we ended up with some of the stories about the nuclear freeze, and that was taking us right into like 81, 82, I think, if I recall.
Yep.
And that's kind of where we ended.
Well, we formed a committee. The board formed a committee. It was called, what was it called? The Service Committee. Yeah, that only lasted 2 years. And that committee did work with the apartheid issue, and the divestment of the endowment fund began to develop in that as a result of that.
So what 2 years was this?
81, 82. That's not an academic year, those are 2 separate calendar years.
Yes.
It also got us into the Prairie Alliance nuclear freeze thing, sane freeze debates, the protest of Reagan over at Eureka College, which was an interesting day. And it began to lift up for the whole organization stuff that was going on in Central America, especially in Nicaragua, and it related us into PACA. And,
Which was for the camera, PACA was.
The People's Alliance in Central America. So that committee, while it only had a short life, introduced a lot of things to all of us.
So this is a board committee that was kind of,
Yeah.
so this is kind of exploring new areas or new programs?
It opened up, well, and I forget what year it was that the board passed the Peace with Justice priority thing, and that gave rise to this committee. It was the committee that.
Wait, that mission statement's new? Like relatively new?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was even, it was rewritten,
Keeps
developing. It was
Keeps
rewritten in the
developing.
early 90s,
Yeah.
if you couldn't tell from some of the language. Because we helped rewrite that.
Yeah.
The,
It's true.
I guess it was probably 71 that the board actually voted that as a program priority. And then this committee got the job of fleshing it out. What did it mean? So it meant all of these things. The radical readings began as a result of it. It wasn't the only thing that was produced radical readings. One day I was coming back, I was already started working on the doctorate over at CTS, and I had got Bob Marley's book of Uprising. That was the title of it, not book.
Or the CD.
CD. And so I put it in the car tape, and so one of the songs in it has to do with resurrection, and the interpretation that Bob Marley put on it was pretty much what I was thinking about, uprising. Another thing that happened was that I was traveling with Frank Helm, who was a regional associate minister, over to Columbus, Ohio, for a meeting of some sort, and we got to talking about the need for a program in the region that was called, the language that we used was a boot camp for liberation theology. So I got to thinking about what is a boot camp for liberation theology, and Bob Marley's music came up with the idea of, well, we need an uprising. So that's how the term uprising finally got.
I've always wanted to know, and it's a really cool story.
And I can bring the CD and I can put it on some of the soundtrack during this
Exactly.
party.
Well, the term resurrection does in fact originally meant in the first century insurrection. That's how Romans understood the term resurrection.
What is
Now
insurrection?
the Jewish people understood resurrection to mean
Insurrection's
something else.
uprising.
But
Oh,
Rome,
okay.
but Rome understood it to be an insurrection. So when Jewish people talked about resurrection, Rome read, trouble. So what I started doing in radical reading was dropping the term resurrection and using the term uprising or insurrection.
Yeah, it does have a better ring to it.
Well, I don't know if it's more accurate, because there is the Jewish interpretation that it meant dead people are raised up, resuscitated. Especially the Pharisees. Pharisees were big on resurrection. And they were the tradition. They were the guardians of tradition. So it's interesting how Christianity has moved from a Roman reading to a more traditional reading.
So the UCF had officially closed its doors. Neighborhood service ministry was happening, but IDF was also still looking now for new ways to do things. And so that's where this service committee came over. What else can we be doing? And there's an activist board involved in neighborhood service ministry, and so now looking for things to kind of plug the hole of the UCF activities in some ways.
Right.
And so you're dealing with issues like apartheid, American activity in Central America, which, because El Salvador kicks in 1980 and stuff, and Nicaragua obviously had the revolution in '79, so that's an issue that comes particularly with the Reagan administration. All these things kind of come together at that point.
The ERA was still going on until '82.
Right.
Did
And the nuclear freeze issue.
so healthcare consumers started in '77. Was there much interaction early on with?
Well, Mike and John Lee both came over to ask us to participate in their first march. They had a march. My recollection was the 4th of July, and but I'm not real sure about that now.
So early on, IDF was involved with some of the activities.
Yeah. So, but we participated in that march. There were a whole bunch of us who went on that, and we did phone-a-thon things, and whenever CCHCC had a fundraiser, somehow participated in that. But we weren't really plugged in to it in a deep way, but we were supportive of it.
Mhm.
Probably Probably we were more involved in political campaigns than we were with CCHCC stuff.
By political campaigns, you mean?
Campaigns of the year that Terry Bruce was elected.
So how did IDF toe that line? Carefully?
Very carefully, yes.
Who's Terry Bruce?
He was our council
Congressional
representative
representative.
Person. I forget what year he was elected.
He was in for quite a while.
But
Till they redistricted.
Jacobson was, in the primary, Jacobson ran against Terry Bruce for the Democratic nomination.
But that's not Naomi, that was
That was
Eric.
not Naomi, that
It's her
was
husband, Eric.
her husband. And Chuck Segar was the treasurer of Jacobson's campaign. And Chuck was real active in the foundation program. I don't remember if he was on the board at that time or not. But anyway, we were close to supporting candidates.
Now things were a little bit different tax-wise then, so we didn't pay as much attention, or?
Well, I was paying attention because
Okay.
we'd already gotten 2 approaches by IRS on our tax exempt status. And
What were these
the
2
board was
approaches?
Huh?
What were the 2 approaches?
They were about 10 years apart. I think the first one came in like in the early 70s and then early 80s and then later in the 90s, in which our tax exempt status was challenged. And in each case, we had to prove that we were a 501c3 not-for-profit religious organization.
Now, was this something that they just kind of happened upon, or did somebody?
No.
Wasn't there
you in.
someone from the co-op that was bitter that someone like who had at some point worked with the foundation had?
When we got into sanctuary, yeah, there was a challenge. That was in the 80s. But that was a challenge to the state
Okay.
revenue department.
Okay.
No, the IRS began to challenge tax exempt status of the National Council of Churches and all the denominations that were members of the National Council of Churches. And then they moved off of that. That was in the 60s. That's why I brought this other one. Big issue that hit us was the grand jury abuse issue. That was in the late 70s. IRS began to use grand juries in local communities to challenge tax exempt status. Those grand juries had there is no such thing anymore as confidentiality in the state of Illinois or any other state in the union. Because grand juries now have the right to subpoena all kinds of documents.
From anyone or from
From
specific?
anybody in any organization. So I got the job in the region of drafting how do we deal with grand juries. So Francis Boyle and some other attorneys, Betsy Long and others, helped me work through that. And it tied into the tax exempt status of the foundation. Part of the reason I was worried about that was not just because of the tax exempt status, but I had some FBI agents come and want to interview me on students who were graduating and who were applying for jobs, government jobs, state, federal jobs. And for some reason they were showing up here asking to interview me about those people. And I'd already learned enough that if the warrant wasn't in the FBI agent's hands, then I didn't have to talk to them. So I refused to talk with them because we weren't sure, at least I wasn't sure, how just a casual comment that I might make could be used out of context with regards to somebody else's job. And since we were already engaged in things that from the 60s on that were considered treasonous, I just didn't want to talk to him. And And since grand juries now had the ability to subpoena records, I just stopped taking notes. Really private conversations, whether they were like confessional statements or
So
marriage
even
counseling.
like your, oh, maybe we've already had this conversation, never mind.
Well, like Allison and John want to be married, and so we're going through this counseling stuff. And things come out in those conversations that it's none of the FBI's business as far as I'm concerned. But since I can subpoena notes, I just quit taking notes when I do marriage counseling or any other kind of counseling. Like the CEO counseling or the selective service counseling. I just stopped taking notes. The notes that I had, I burned. So, as far as I know, if FBI agent comes with a warrant, wants to know what Allison and John are up to.
So what I may be missing is the
I can
historical.
say I don't know those people.
So did the grand jury thing just come into being in the late 70s? Was that it?
Well,
Because I'm
that's
at
when
this-
it surfaced. That's when it surfaced.
But there were no grand juries before then, and that was something that was.
Oh, no,
created?
there were grand
There were
juries.
always grand
They were
juries.
Well,
expanding-
so what was the shift?
They were
The
expanding
So
their
was
powers.
that the government was using grand juries to subpoena material.
Okay,
for
so that was
whatever
the shift.
purpose. And the first attempt was at the National Council of Churches. 2 or 3 women who were not on the, were staff members, but not primary staff members, but were like a support staff, were subpoenaed for all of the records that they kept in their own desk. The 3 women who were deeply devout persons and sort of guessed or knew that what FBI was up to, refused to turn those records over. So they were arrested and they were questioned by the grand jury, and they refused to testify in the grand jury. So the grand jury threw them in jail and held them there for over 6 months. And then that grand jury was dissolved, and a new grand jury came into being, and that grand jury held them in prison for another 6 months. So as churches begin to realize that that this could happen to staff, the need for a policy. So somewhere in the foundation's records, you'll find the policy, which was we don't keep notes, and if Holiman wants to go to jail for refusing to testify, that's fine with us. Okay, thanks.
So we have that in notes,
Yeah, somewhere.
just not the other stuff in notes.
Right. It's
The note about the notes.
it's in the, it should be,
Probably
there should be a
minutes.
file on IDS policies, social policies. That's what it should be. And if a secondary staff person, like at that point it was Jackie Sturdivant, who was actually worked for the church, she was doing all of our records and our stuff, and she kept files, so it was protecting her right also on that score. And there was some financial support available to help offset legal costs if that happened.
And so that policy has not been changed to this day?
Not that I know of.
Interesting.
I have a side question that I don't think I've raised yet. During this whole period of from the 60s, the 70s, into the 80s, did IDF have any newsletters? Because the Voice didn't come into being until
1976.
76. But before that, did the foundation have any kind of
Yes,
newsletters?
it was called, it was 1964, 65, and there it was called the Disciple Herald.
And that was ours?
That was ours.
Doesn't someone do it just like, I swear.
Hmm?
But does someone now currently do a Disciples Herald?
I don't know. There may be. But the Messenger of the Church newsletter was the only thing that we had available to us. And only the last page of the Messenger was devoted to foundation. And so I started the Disciple Herald. And it was published once a month, and it only contained Disciple Foundation news. And we published 9 issues of it. a very expensive operation. And I forget how much our budget was, less than $15,000 at that time. And we just couldn't afford it, so we didn't publish it but 1 year.
Do you have copies of those, Jim?
Yeah, I do somewhere. I'll have to dig them out. But,
So that was
We might have
when you
copies.
first, that was when you first came on board then, so that was
yeah, it's very early.
mid-60s then. So then for a decade, nothing happened until you said then The Voice started in 76?
Yeah. We used the back page of the church's messenger.
In the interim. And so what was the decision to do The Voice? How did that come about?
Well, tensions had already, we were in a conflicted mode with the church, and the back page was it was being censored somewhat. There were things that I was not able to say, like I could not use the words radical reading. So there was a need for our own thing. And I was tired of writing. Theirs was coming out weekly, the church's messenger, and you had to go through this rigmarole of making sure that you were politically correct in what you put in it. And I was tired of it, so I just stopped writing it for the church. And finally they dropped off anything on the back page, which was bad because that meant, the bad side of that was bad because that meant the congregation was not getting any news, even though it was censored from us directly. The good part was that the good part was that I didn't have to write those articles.
The censored article.
The censored article. There was a lot of criticism from the board, from the foundation board. You should be doing this, Jim. So. But I would write an article from time to time for the messenger, provided it was not on the back page.
So when The Voice was started, what was the concept? Was it just to be a newsletter, or was it?
It was a newsletter. It wasn't until Paul Morgan came on staff in the 80s, whenever that was, that Paul wanted us to do more commentary on current things going on in the world.
That was probably the mid-'80s, I think, because wasn't he a church mouse, or not?
Yeah, no, he was a campus minister associate, I think.
Oh, campus ministry associate.
So at that point, we became a news commentary. We carried newsletter material as well as commentary. But we were carrying I was writing viewpoints before that, so it was no big job. It was just that other people could write things besides me. So.
Okay. That was just a little sidebar. I realized that we hadn't talked about that issue at all.
Well, that's okay. This jogs the thing. How did it get the name, The Voice? There was a debate about that because there were a number of media organizations in town that were using the word voice. And there were some national things that used the word voice. So there was a debate about the term. I don't think I've ever shared this with anybody except one person. This goes back to 1948. As I was rummaging through this piece of roll, I hit upon an interesting thing. Matthew, the 4th chapter, the 10th verse. Matthew, the 4th chapter, is the chapter that contains the temptations of Jesus. And Satan is doing the temptation. And in the 10th verse, it says, if I can read this. Yes, I can read it better this way. Thus saith Jesus, this is King James stuff, unto him that said, say, get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. And that's the end of the temptations. And just before that, Jesus appears and he sees Joe, Jeff, Jen, Brooke, walking around in Galilee and says, follow me.
I didn't know we were in the Bible.
And that's all it takes. They get up and follow. And what was going through my mind when I first read that was this thought, which has stuck with me. What have I got to lose? At that point in my life, I had nothing to lose. So that was the voice.
The voice was the internal voice, or the voice was his voice?
I don't
saying-
know.
Okay.
A voice.
Okay, well,
I have no idea. I have an idea, but that's for your imagination to work with. And then later in the '68 kind of thing, there was the same thing. There was certainly the religious thing had collapsed, and the governmental thing was collapsing. I mean, people were getting assassinated because they were interested in social justice stuff. So okay, what have you got to lose? So when the debate got going about the voice, that's what I was arguing. That was in my head. That's what I argued, and I won that argument.
It's a good time.
Where are we?
so before that, we were kind of just starting off with we had like the service committee, 81, 82. Kind of IDF was jumping into different things. The radical readings had started. Peace with Justice Priority was being fleshed out. So that's kind of where we left it. So I guess IDF at this point is exploring lots of things, looking at different things. First, testing the waters, I guess, on some of the Central America stuff with the People's Alliance on Central America.
What would you say was, if anything shook out in that period, between 79 and 81, what would you say would be like the first issue that began to be tackled? Because I don't think you could tackle them all at the same time, right?
Well, we tried.
Yeah, I figured you would.
I guess one of the things that shook out for everybody, not just me, but everybody. Again, I don't remember what year. Probably 80 or 81. Got a phone call from a guy up at Oak Park, Austin Boulevard, Christian Church on McCord. He's the pastor. I guess he still is, or maybe he's retired by now. And he wanted to know if he could send a guy from Zaire down who had appeared in the congregation there at Austin Boulevard seeking sanctuary. He was trying to escape from the Mobutu government in Zaire. And he needed money. And Don had given him some money, enough to get him out of town anyway. And he was looking for a place to land him.
I think we visited this a little bit last time.
Might have talked about this a little bit.
So I said, yeah, send him on down. So he came. And Yamba Bokamba was on the board. And these two guys knew one another because they were part of the same tribe in Zaire as was Mobutu. And both had come to, both Nkanaga and Yamba had come to the United States, escaping from the political violence that Mobutu had brought about as president of Zaire. So the whole board got involved, and we took Nkanaga in, and he lived on the third floor sanctuary from hiding from the Secret Service of Zaire for about 3 years. He had to leave, because we had moved into sanctuary and we were bringing in Central American refugees. And he felt, Conga felt, that that was going to bring too much attention to the building and he would eventually be found. So he left for Nashville. But the whole board was involved in that interesting period. And I think that probably more than anything else helped move the board to be willing to commit civil disobedience or civil resistance. That is, they had reached a point where they were willing to step across that boundary. Even though they kind of fell into that because I answered that phone. So I think that had big implications for the board.
So that set the stage a little bit. And so then People's Alliance on Central America formed around when? Late 70s? Was it like after the Sandinista Revolution? Or?
It was the late 70s, early 80s. I guess it was probably 1980.
Is that Neil Fox?
There were two Central American organizations
That's
on
right.
campus. I forget what the other one was called.
Well, they merged into PACA, I think, right?
They merged into PACA. There was this big debate. Belden Fields had a big thing to do with it.
Neil Fox was a big
Neil
person.
Fox had a part in it. Julia Rappaport had a big thing to do with it. Steve Lodrick had it. Those were the key players in that merger. Belden and Steve, I think, played the biggest role in it. The debate seemed to be over support for Nicaragua. Was it going to be material aid that was limited to welfare kinds of issues, or was it going to be material aid that also included weapons? Joe, you probably remember that better than I do.
I wasn't here at that point.
No.
Yeah, I didn't get involved with PACA until I came here in '85.
So, Belden was not in favor of supplying weapons. So there was this compromise made. And PACA came into existence.
At one point I knew what the names of the two other groups were, but I forget
Yeah,
now.
I don't remember either. Largely because PACA survived. And lots of, I began to going to PACA almost from the beginning of its existence. So that was not so much something that the committee on, service committee got involved in, that was something I was involved in, Steve was involved in.
Now, was Steve the church mouse at that point?
Mm-hmm.
So that, from what you told me before, I mean, he helped move IDF into the Central America work.
Sure
So he
did.
helped move it by moving you into the work.
Sure did.
So that meant he lived in the one with the bathroom. That was where the church mouse lived.
He was the church mouse. He may have been our last church mouse.
So he was living there when the Zairian guy was living up there as well.
I believe so. Toward the end of it.
Well, I think one of the things, and this might be later, but I know in the struggles that PACA had with CISPAS, but I think PACA's part of their, besides maybe the material aid issue, was also that they didn't want to be single country focused. Like they didn't just want to focus on Nicaragua, or later didn't want to just focus on El Salvador. They wanted to, that's why they were the People's Alliance on Central America. They didn't want to just be
Right.
where a lot of the support groups for those solidarity movements were usually focused on that country solely.
Right.
So I think that was one of the things that they.
Right, they were. CISPAS was very much involved with Sandinista.
No, CISPAS was off in El Salvador still.
El Salvador.
Yeah, but it was also doing other stuff too.
I think we had a similar in Australia at that time. We had a committee, CISCAC, Committee in Support of Central America and the Caribbean.
Yeah.
And that was our overarching solidarity movement. And CISPES was trying to challenge us to focus more on El Salvador, or to pick one basically, as opposed to having the broader
Broader
kind of
scope.
perspective. But the reality was, is we were working on Grenada, we were working on Nicaragua, we were working on El Salvador. I mean, there was the whole area was up in arms, so to speak, at that point.
And so part of the context for Jen, I guess, I mean, this wasn't just academic exercise in some way too, because with Reagan in office, and well, I mean, the revolution happened in Nicaragua, but then with Reagan came in, there was a lot of people were fearing there was going to be a war, and that the U.S. was going to invade El Salvador. The U.S. was bombing El Salvador, was involved with the Contras in Nicaragua. So I think it was happening all over the place, and I think a lot of people.
And they overthrow the government in Grenada in '83, so that's an actual.
So a lot of people were
invasion.
worried that this was going to be the next Vietnam, somewhere there. So
Right.
that was, and Zapaco was huge.
Yeah.
It lasted for a long time, but I mean, it was huge through the '70s, through most of the '80s.
Well, there was a whole conflict, or a whole complex of issues there. And we got involved in all of that through me, through Steve, and to some degree, the same folk who were involved in the Prairie Alliance and St. Freeze were also involved in PACA, or the forerunner of PACA. So there was a community of activists that it began to clear that there was a community of activists. They sometimes overlapped, sometimes they focused on one specific thing. Greg Slocum, who was the chairperson of the Prairie Alliance, was so focused on the nuclear arms race that he was not too involved with these other things. He was a very key player, though, on the foundation board, and got many of the other board members involved in that effort, as well as recruiting new bodies into the foundation program. So that was he is another example of a board member who was a part of a working board. He saw all of his activities in the Prairie Alliance really as foundation based, and he used the foundation as a base for that work. So it was a whole complex of things that were going on in the early stages of the 80s. In '83, things for us began to focus down on El Salvador and Guatemala. And again, it was Steve work with PACA that began to bring that to bear. Somewhere along the line, Steve volunteered to be a way station himself. Of course, he lived here, so
He was a student at the time.
yeah. So IDF became a way station, unbeknownst to any of us except Steve. And one day he came and asked me, he says, I'm having some guests in, is that okay? And I said, sure, that's okay, it's your room, and the policy says you can have guests, He says, well, I just wanted to know if you wanted to know who they were. That was kind of a suspicious question, and I said, no, I don't think I need to know that, Steve. So I went on my way, and Steve went on his way. Then maybe 3 or 4 weeks later, he asked me if I would be willing to come over and meet some of the people that were coming in. He thought that I would find this interesting, so I came over. And I met the people who were driving political refugees across the country to someplace in Maine, and I met the 3 refugees. They were all kids. One was probably 12 or 13. Another one was maybe 9 or 10, and then there was a younger one. And then there were 2 drivers.
They were El Salvadoran.
Salvadorians. And they were on their way to a sanctuary site in Maine. So So, and the people who were driving the car, so this is an opportunity for somebody else to hear the stories of these three kids, so we listened to their stories. The drivers had to translate because the kids couldn't speak English. I forget the name of the village they were a part of, but one day the National Guard moved into their village and started killing people. And the parents of these children hid them under a bed, and just got them hidden when the troops broke into their house. And the father was killed, and the mother was raped, and then her throat was slit, and then the troops left. So the kids stayed hidden until relatives from another village came to see if anybody had survived, I guess, and found the three kids and helped them escape to Mexico, and then from Mexico to Arizona. And in Arizona, they fell into the hands of the Tucson Ecumenical Council, which was running the sanctuary program there. And then this sanctuary unit in Maine said they would take them.
Jim, hold that thought for a second.
So that was the story these kids told, and it was something that I was not able to close down. I wasn't able to turn away from that. So I got to talking to different board members about that experience. Eric Dale, who was a disciple pastor but was working for the Community United Church Foundation at that time. His brother Dan Dale was one of the national organizers of the sanctuary movement. So
Jane Dale from Chicago.
And so I told him about this visit and also about material that I had been reading from the National Council of Churches about refugees, political refugees. And so we decided that we'd try to, well, we had this conversation driving down from the food co-op to Tuscola to get cheese. To Arthur, Illinois, to get cheese for the food co-op. And so on that drive, we decided we'd try to start a public sanctuary here if we could find enough people. So I voted.
And this is 83?
82? I think it was 82. 82. Spring of 82. So I agreed to write a letter to all the clergy in town, and Eric was going to follow up with phone calls, I think it was. And we'd get back together in October to see what we'd found. So we got back together, and I invited Steve to meet with us, and we had found that no clergy had responded. So Steve said, well, I'll set up, I'll apply for a meeting room in the union, and you guys keep at it, and Paco will join you in sponsoring that meeting. So a meeting was set for December. Steve got the room. Eric and I continued to invite people. There were only 3 clergy who showed up at the meeting in December. That was Eric, myself, and Father Tom Royer from St. Mary's, which was not enough to pull us off. So Steve said we ought to keep Paco on board. When you're ready, well, let us know. We won't be able to join the sanctuary unit, but we can supply bodies and maybe some money. So we kept meeting, and by May, I guess, the following year, 83, we had maybe 30 or 40 people from different churches involved. And so we reached a decision, but no institutional representatives really. There were just people who the decision was, okay, we'll try to get institutions involved. We need at least 3 that'll go on, will commit themselves to being a part of the co-sponsored public sanctuary. So we got started on that.
Can you explain me? I remember some of the debates, but what is a public sanctuary? Can you define what the key terms were of that?
A public sanctuary.
Because before, what Ludwig was doing wasn't public
No,
sanctuary,
it was called a way station.
and what the Zairean wasn't public sanctuary either.
Yeah. It was more just a sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
Public sanctuary is where the public sanctuary goes on record with all of the governmental officials that are concerned as providing public sanctuary for an undocumented person from either El Salvador or Guatemala who is fleeing from violence and seeking public asylum and who's been denied that. And so it's an act of, from our reading of it, of civil resistance. Civil resistance differs from civil disobedience in that you decided that since the government is not going to carry out its legal obligation to provide official service for human beings, then a group of people organize to provide that service in place of the government. In other words, you put yourself in the place of the government to carry out a governmental action. And you declare that the government is engaged in legal lawlessness because it fails to provide that service. So we were claiming that it is the government that is doing civil disobedience. And we are resisting that. No court in the land has ever granted that argument. But that's the position we took.
So, sorry, I wanted to get that definition
Yeah.
on tape. So
all the board members, all the foundation board members were involved in preliminary study discussions about that, all of which ended in a 3-day retreat that was held over in the chapel. We brought in political refugees, we brought in national organizers.
and this was in '83 then. This was spring of '83.
And we brought in guys like Dan Dale, who were national organizers, to explain to the board what was going on.
Who were some of the people on the board at this point?
L.D. Castillo, Dave Duncan, Marion Yarber, Rafe Miller,
Clyde.
Clyde Smith, Joanne Amaker, Esther Ewald, Inez Curtis, Glenn Whitmer, Karen Martin Llewellyn, who was the associate pastor at University Place Church. How many is that?
Bunch.
Not 18.
Yeah, but
No.
more than we have now.
There were more.
Strike that.
Uh,
Well, that's good. I just
Chuck Seeger, I guess.
Chuck was probably
Was Rafe Miller on because he was the pastor, or was this after he was the pastor?
he was still the pastor.
He was still a pastor.
Was Carlos
left.
Brook on at that point, or was that later?
But Rafe left in '83, right?
He
So
left.
soon after
He
this
left
was-
that summer.
Who was the moderator at this point?
Tom Jolly, that's a new one.
Tom Jolly. Well, you don't have to name everybody. That gives.
Yeah, well, there's a bunch more.
I'm impressed you got all those names.
Well, for the 3-day meeting, I'm figuring there was probably some, you know.
Another one, Owen, who was...
Ellen Jablow?
No, Oline was his name.
Oh.
He was the legal counsel to the president of the University of Illinois.
During his time on the board?
Yeah.
Well, not for long after this.
Not
He's one of the
for
people.
long.
Oh, right, I think I've heard the story.
So anyway, I don't know if we had 18 or not at that time, but we certainly were getting there. So, the day after the retreat was when we started a board meeting.
And now, at this point, was Quakos formed yet, or there was just this concept? This was still in the exploratory phase that every institution had to decide if they were going to come on board, and this was IDF's part
Right.
to say we can come
Right.
on board.
Right. So the first decision that the board made was it had to be a unanimous decision. It had to be a unanimous no or a unanimous yes, we would be a public sanctuary.
So you would fight it out until it was one way or the other? Like if there was
Yes.
like half and half, you
Yeah, it
stick
had
at
to
it
be,
until...
yeah.
Like a jury.
Wasn't
Yes,
this
I'm sorry.
wasn't this really just some Quaker consensus thing creeping in there, Jim?
No, it had to be unanimous yes, a unanimous no, and it had to continue until we reached that unanimity.
Like continue, like as in you can't leave the building,
Uh,
but you go like,
Yes.
you go use the bathroom, you have to come back in and
And
keep...
the second was that if it was a unanimous yes, we had to have at least 3 other institutions on board. It took us 3.
This wasn't about the space being used at all. It was just about being part
We
of
would
this.
we would offer our space.
So the space was part of the decision that was being made. It wasn't just
Right.
we will support this.
Yeah, I was arguing that we were
Because
gonna
that
do
was a
this.
higher, that's almost a higher thing. The other institutions had to just say we're supporting
Right,
it, but they didn't
right,
have to give their
right.
space.
I argued that this was the space.
Okay.
Won that. But there was no big deal. Well, it took 3 days before we reached a unanimous decision. We did not stay in the building 24
Many
hours.
people went home to sleep.
We stayed in the building 8 hours a day, then everybody went home, then we came back the next morning. The important thing for me was that Rafe Miller and Karen Martin Llewellyn and all the people who were on the foundation board were also members of University Place Church.
Not all, but some.
I think nearly
Those
all.
3 people were members.
Oh, but people like, not all the IDF board members, like Dee Castile wasn't part of the church.
Yeah, she was.
Or she was, okay.
She was chair of the Church and Society.
Chuck Seagar was chair, was
I
part of the
don't
church?
think, no, Chuck wasn't.
But he might not have been on at that point. He might have been
He
on.
not
later.
have been, but I think he was.
But Clyde was, Inez was, Esther Ewell was, so they were all, okay.
Others are Mary Ann Crafts Branner, was on the board. Brian, I don't remember Brian's last name, he was the next coordinator, main coordinator in the food co-op.
So these were-
Nancy Irish was on the board.
Was she part of the
Sharon
church?
Irish was on the board.
Were they both part of the church or they were part of the co-op?
They were not on the part of the church, they were part of the IDF.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the 18th. Anyway, so we voted yes. The end of August came, or the beginning of the fall semester came, that was when we were gonna meet again. as a
So
big group.
this was like summertime then?
Summertime, okay. And we were all meeting up at St. Mary's, and none of the other bodies had even had a meeting. So, but we had approved it, and we had said we're gonna offer a building, we gotta have 3 others. So between that time and January, the other 4 bodies came on board. I don't remember right now who. I think United Church was next. I think McKinley was next. I think the Friends, the Quakers were next, and St. Mary's was the last. The reason St. Mary's was last was because they had to go through 2 separate political processes to arrive at a decision.
Where's St. Mary's?
Up the street. It's right across from
Hospital.
From
Provena.
to the east of Provena.
Park
It's the
Street.
oldest Roman Catholic parish in
I
town.
think it's Park Street.
Oh, okay, okay.
Isn't it? I think it's Park.
It was the very first Roman Catholic church in the county.
So those 4 then came on by January.
Right, so that was when the decision was made to create Quicos.
And that stands for, Jim?
Champaign-Urbana Ecumenical Committee on Sanctuary. Quicos sent Frankie Day and me to the first National Sanctuary Gathering in Tucson, Arizona. That was at the sanctuary.
I don't get sent anywhere like Tucson.
So we went, and it was a wild and woolly meeting. There were about 500 people there. We were meeting in a hotel. It was immediately obvious that there were spheres of influence in these people. There was the Chicago Religious Task Force on Central America, there was the Los Angeles Task Force on Central America, and there was the Tucson outfit. And there was a little group back in Washington, D.C. That claimed to have influence because they were in Washington, D.C.
That's always the story.
And these groups did not agree. None of the rest of us there knew anything about this because we were brand new.
Is this the
So-
first national meeting of the
Yeah.
sanctuary stuff?
And there were great speakers there. There was William Sloane Coffin. There was Robert McAfee Brown. There was the leading Jewish rabbi of the country, who had the largest. He was rabbi of the largest synagogue in the country. There was the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles. I forget what his name was. There was the Roman Catholic Bishop from Milwaukee. These were big, powerful speakers.
When was Romero assassinated again? Was it
80.
80.
March.
And they were just tremendous hearing these people. There were some lawyers, big time lawyers. What was the big guy? He defended all of the defendless.
Kunstler?
Yes. So we were inspired by these big speakers. We were not so much inspired by these spheres of influence. And we weren't getting anywhere. So finally, we said, you guys go up on the big spheres of influence. You guys go up on the 5th floor or wherever and talk it out. One of you got to be the leaders, because none of the rest of us know what we're doing. So they agreed, and they went up to wherever they were going. And the rest of us stayed downstairs and concocted workshops. There were sanctuaries already in existence, so those of us who didn't have one in existence, or working anyway, wanted to hear from these people what they had done right, what they had done wrong. And so we had maybe 10 or 12 different workshops going, waiting for the decision makers to make a decision. And finally Sunday arrived, and people had to go back to their communities to go to work. And it didn't look like these people were going to come down. So we held our own meeting, and 3 people were elected to form the first National Sanctuary Committee. And some of the workers of the Chicago Task Force panicked, and they came to me and said, would you allow us to throw your name in nomination? And I didn't have anything better to do, plus I wanted to try my hand at national organizing. So I said, sure. And 2 other people were put up for office, and well, actually, I guess there were 5 or 6 people put up. And after 3 or 4 ballots, 3 of us were elected. And they gave us.
And this was done, basically you just took it out from under these people
Yeah,
who were
we
still
did.
upstairs trying to
We
argue
did.
who was gonna run the thing.
So,
Cool.
and they gave us 2 months to pull it off. And about that time, somebody went upstairs and said, spheres of influence, we've solved the problem and we're all going home. So there was just enough time for the 3 of us who were elected to exchange addresses, names, and telephone numbers. And off we went. So we got busy, and we had to create 17 regions, because that was where sanctuaries were already functioning, and we had to figure out how to get them together. So we created 17 regions. We got those regions to meet and select representatives to the first fully official National Sanctuary Communication Council. That's what it was called. And it was held in LA. March. So it was a fast piece of organizing.
So you were on this committee before we even had anybody here.
Yep. And our first refugees were May 13th.
May 13th of '84. And that was, well, their names that they were known by were David and Eva Vargas.
And they were here nearly 2 years.
When I first met them in 85 or 86 when I came back to the community.
But what I don't want to, I want to move towards ending this part, 'cause I think that's a good break point, 'cause I think there's a lot of things to talk about sanctuary and the foundation. And we can, I don't want to talk so much about David and Ava, let's save that for next time, but let's just maybe have any questions about the setup and things like that. So the board was flying you out. I mean, I guess just so things up to this point. So the board was supporting this, right? So, but some people on the board quit, right? Did they quit right away after the vote? Or when the...
Well, the first step after we had refugees, well, the first step before we had refugees was to write a letter to the President, to the Attorney General of the United States, to INS. There were a bunch of, to the senators, to the Congress people, saying, this is what we're doing. And we're doing this because you guys aren't doing it. So we're not committing civil disobedience, we're doing your job for you. If you don't like it, then come arrest us. It was not that blunt, but it was throwing out the gauntlet. And we mailed those letters. Well, it took a month to get the 5 institutions to agree to the letter that we were sending out. And in the process, the board met again, the foundation board met again, and the board had to approve the letter that we were going to send. David O'Lean, the legal counsel to the university, this is where he changed his mind.
But he had already voted okay.
He voted okay.
Earlier, okay.
And, but he had not anticipated, he did not understand the civil resistance angle. He understood civil disobedience. And if you're going to commit civil disobedience, you don't notify the authorities that you're going to commit civil disobedience. Because they might show up with the police and arrest you on the spot. So
Some people want that.
So he and Clyde got into it. And that was interesting. I watched Clyde, who very seldom spoke so vehemently for a position. And Clyde argued him into the ground, and the guy resigned right there on the spot and left.
And Rafe Miller was already gone at this point because he had left the church?
No, he was leaving at the end of May.
Okay.
Joanne Amaker resigned her position right after the vote was taken.
So you
Because
be assistant?
to become a public sanctuary,
No, she wasn't the assistant. She's just a long-time church
No,
member.
she was
She's on the hiring committee for
she was-
Faircloth with him.
and she was on the hiring committee for Roger Jenks. And she was the moderator of the church board. But she resigned because her husband was a contractor who received federal grants. And she was afraid that he would lose federal grants if it came out that he was married to her. So she resigned, but not because she was opposed to sanctuary. She resigned because she didn't want a divorce. Or whatever might have happened. So those were the intermediate resignations. Now, right after about a week, or 2 weeks after about 2 weeks after the board had voted and the public notice had gone out that there was going to be a public sanctuary, but we didn't know who all the sponsors were going to be. Karen Martin Llewellyn, who was the associate pastor of Union Place, asked for a meeting with me. So we were going to have lunch together, and she met me down at the office, and before we got out the door, she had told me what the issue was. And her opening words were, "We have a problem." Well, whenever somebody says to me, "We have a problem," and I don't know what the problem is, I'm suspicious. And by the time we got to the car, she had told me what the problem was. Namely, that University Place Church was not happy. And since Rafe had already left his position, and there was no senior pastor, she was the next person on the hot seat as far as the congregation was concerned. And I guess there had been a threat made. She never shared with me what the threat was, but it had to be a personal threat. Like, "We're going to fire you if you don't stop this. And we know that you're on the board of the foundation, so you've got to blah, 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 do this."
But she wasn't the only one on the board, right?
No, she
From the
wasn't.
church, right?
So it was a very unpleasant lunch. We got into a verbal sparring match. By the time we got back to the building, things had gotten very heated. And we came in the side door over here, the ramp thing that wasn't built then. It was a series of steps. And we got to her office, and she peeled off. And I said I forget what she had said to me, and I called her a wimp. And that was.
Because she had agreed with everything up to
Yeah,
this point.
she'd been, and,
Right.
you know,
So now she was receiving pressure.
yeah. So, at the, let's see, we met in August. The next regular meeting was October. So at the October board meeting, is that right? No, November is the regular board meeting date, isn't it?
December.
October, December.
October or December.
Okay, October. She spoke against,
This is before there was somebody in public sanctuary, so this
Yes.
is 83. Okay.
she spoke against the board and me on the grounds that the endowment monies that had been given to the foundation were really intended for University Place Church, and that we were spending money for money that came off the endowment fund for the operating budget for engaging in legal activity. And the church was concerned and might bring suit against us, and that I ought to be fired.
She didn't think of any of this stuff before, though. Right?
Apparently not. So, fortunately, a good number of the board members were members of University Place Church, and they said, you know, we haven't heard any of this. And so she resigned and left. So she was the third person, I guess the third person, or second person. Holiman was the third person to resign.
Well, do we want to end with?
So,
Yeah.
anyway, it was to get worse.
Mm.
Here are a bunch of, we didn't talk about these this time, but here are the photographs of the Global Awareness Seminars from 81 to 83, that you might want to look at sometime.
Can Jen borrow those too to scan?
Sure, yeah. And this is we had a meeting early in the 80s for all the public service organizations in the county. And so there were a whole bunch of those, not all of them showed up, but there's a whole bunch of photographs of those bodies. So here are Here, this goes back into the 1980s. Here's a survey document that our people carried out on the strike. We called it the strike at the university, which all of the month of May in 1970, the university did not function because all the students went on strike. And here's a pamphlet on one of the first public hearings we held on May 27, with all the big wheels dealing with the strike. So those are documents that you might want to look into. And because of the conflict that we had with University Place Church in 1979, 1980, the foundation decided it needed its own pastors' relations committee to be the force troops against any attacks from the University Place Church.
Oh, that's what pastor relations is supposed to do.
That had to do with the split of, well, when I used a curse on one of the church boards, which I told you about.
Do you want to pass me one?
And,
Pictures
and also,
of the voice cover with the furniture.
the bishop coming to demand my resignation.
Ooh.
So the board decided we need a pastors' relations committee that will serve as the buffer zone between the foundation and any attacks.
Hey Jim, did that banner, just remember the People of Faith for the ERA banner, did that go away somewhere? Did we lose that?
I haven't seen it.
They just hang down in
No, I know it did, but I remember there was a period where, 'cause remember somebody stole that Romero one, right, and it showed up years later?
the, no, we had two that were stolen
But
from
one-
the sanctuary.
One is in the chapel.
The Romero one?
Romero
Yes.
cut in half.
Yes.
No, that's
No, because
the
remember I
muddy
took
one.
photos of you.
The muddy one. Is it muddy?
Muddy as in the art's muddy, or like there's mud?
Mud.
No.
Mud. It was the first one.
There's
that
a
was-
quote, his face painted.
That was
And it
Greg,
hangs.
Greg did that,
Greg,
Greg.
whatever his last name was. That was the first one that was stolen. And we later found it. It was all wadded up, and it was underneath the chapel.
Yeah, I
Crawl
know.
space in there.
Crawl space is kind of
And
crazy.
when it rains, it sort of gets wet under there, and that's that dark stuff that's on the white.
Clyde
banner.
Smith's the photographer?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Was the mud. The second banner, that's got Romero's face on it, but it's been slashed, was the second one that was stolen.
Huh.
The third one was, one day Chuck Seeger came running into the office and said, "Jim, they're burning one of our banners on the quad." And by the time I got to the quad, there was nothing but ashes left. So somebody had stolen the banner, taken it to the quad and burned it.
We should find that ERA one, I wonder what happened to that one.
We don't have it.
Well,
Unless it's like hiding in a
well, this question is
unknown, invisible closet.
Well, that's a possibility.
Like the United States flag was for many years.
Are we like off camera?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, it's just random. It's not like inappropriate. Okay.
That's Chuck.
Oh, gee. I don't recognize it.
Chuck with the beard.
I recognize the furniture, so I'm.
Yeah.
So before, so we need to pick our
There's a
next.
Pepsi machine in here somewhere.
Yes.
Pepsi.
So, August. How about August 12th, Jim?
Hey, that's when that table was actually a table.
Yeah, what's going
Yeah,
on?
that's
When
right.
you could actually use it.
We actually had furniture and people
That
could
was
sit on
functional.
and stuff.
How about August 12th?
What about it?
For the
Next
next,
session?
next session.
I have a feeling there's something on that day.
It always
Let
comes
me
up
tell
with
you
the
what it
limit.
is.
Lots of photos of
August
DKs.
12th, I think, is a Healthcare Consumers Board retreat. And I am correct. From 11 to 2
August 12th.
in here.
Well, Jim should know that then too.
Yes, I have it.
Okay.
11 o'clock.
We could do it, I mean, like later in the afternoon.
I don't know if you want to do it after a board retreat.
How about the 19th?
That's our board meeting.
19th board meeting. Following weekend's gonna be bad for me too. That's why I was proposing that weekend.
Well, what
How about the 5th? Is that too soon? Jack and Katie don't come to the next day, right?
I'm
And
supposed to
I
go
won't
out
be
of
here.
town,
I won't
but
be here.
I think that plans are.
I don't go back until Sunday.
Like that, or you're just right, you're getting right back.
That weekend is, or not that weekend, but those days, that's our 48th wedding anniversary, so
The 5th and the 6th?
the 6th is, but
The
we'll be
6th.
gone by
Yeah.
So actually, that reminds me of something I should talk to you off camera.
Okay, what about the,
Wanna wait till September?
It is, yeah, I am. What
so,
are we doing?
Where are we? Where did
we are
leave off?
doing the oral history project, part the 6th. This is the 6th one. And
Time flies when you're having fun, Jim.
we're on August the 13th today, and we got Jim. We've also got in attendance, your name?
Aaron.
Your name?
Dean.
Here's where we always fail because I don't Jeff?
Jeff's nose. And Joe.
So I didn't flip around the thing this time. And so the previous time before the previous time, we had a bunch of email discussion in between, and we started off with those questions. So last episode was mostly a flashback episode. It was off of continuity. So the last one, we did a whole bunch of flashback stuff on the UCF, more details on that. We talked about the witches that used to meet out there. We talked about liberation theology a bit, and then we went into the 80s with the service committee from 81 to 82, kind of the work that was going on at the foundation. We talked about the voice, because we hadn't actually talked about the voice at all. And we talked about Zaire, the Zairean refugees. And we talked about People's Alliance on Central America. This was kind of the where the sanctuary stuff was starting to happen. Then we talked about May of 82 and 83, the pre-Quakos meetings, when the whole idea of Quakos was starting to develop, and public sanctuary, and how Jim and a bunch of other people, the proto-Quakos people, Quakos formed in, I think, January of 84, we said. There was a retreat in the summer of 83, and then May of 84 is when the refugees came. But in that period of time also, Jim and other people had gone out to this conference in Tucson, and the rebellion from the grassroots came up or whatever. All the leaders were too busy arguing over what to do, so all the people who weren't the leaders ended up assuming the leadership. So Jim came back from that as one of the national leaders of Sanctuary, as well as Frankie Day.
No, Frankie didn't, but one person from California, San Francisco, and the other from Tucson.
Okay. So we pretty much ended with IDF committing to Sanctuary and starting Sanctuary, but didn't go into any of that. So we kind of ended around there. So the thought was today that we would go further into that, and then we can even flash back a little bit more into some things, and then move up into at least the first Gulf War. I think is the plan.
Something like that.
Something like that. Is that an accurate summation?
I think so.
You think so?
I was here.
Okay. Well, we didn't have as much discussion in the interim because last time was our discussion of the previous one. So, and we also did talk about, well, part of what we're starting to hit now, and of course we don't have name in here, but I think he just got back in town. Joe is trying to piece together his time. So we started. It was another sidebar to the sidebar, because Joe's first day in town.
We were all starting to kind of.
He was trying to figure out, well, how come he wasn't at the IDF in the 70s? What was he doing and other stuff? And we did talk about, and actually we figured out the global awareness seminars that IDF did. Joe figures he was at least one of those, one on China.
The earlier ones.
So we're trying, and so as we hit the mid 80s, well, if Naaman were here, Naaman was very involved in Sanctuary. I came in the tail end. Ron came in, but we're going to start hitting the phase where at least Joe and I start to come in more into the picture, at least by the end of this one. Even before. So
Somebody ask a question and we'll begin there.
Well, so I mean,
Where do you want to start?
Okay, well, so I think, we had just touched on it briefly, and we probably can go over that again. So IDF made the decision. We kind of talked about the board mechanics and how there was a lot of discussion. It had to come out unanimous. It went on for a long time, but the board decided to support public sanctuary. And the first refugees were known as Davida Neva Vargas, came here in '84. So I guess my question would be, how did sanctuary change the IDF? How did public sanctuary change the IDF how did IDF work with Quakos? How did all these things start to happen, and what was going on? Is that good enough, or is that way
Yeah.
too broad?
No, that's fine. Well, the change factor was began in 8. Whereas the change was not, it wasn't accidental. I think it was in 79, presented a proposal to the board about the conflict that was beginning to develop between the PCC and the IDF. And I think I shared with Martine a copy of the thing that I wrote at that time. So that was kind of the beginning of making a transition from kind of a reform organization to something beyond it. What the beyond was, no one knew. But I was hoping that we could move beyond reform kind of status. And the Global Awareness Seminars became an educational tool or an ideological tool for bringing about some mental changes. And especially the one on China, the one on South Africa, and the one on Latin America. And I say that those had an impact because we were writing grants for those programs, and we were getting the most money for them from the Colvin Fund. And it was granting us $5,000 for each one, and the IDF board was granting another $5,000. So we had a $10,000 budget to work those things. But once the Latin American Liberation Theology Seminar was carried off, Colvin would not touch it anymore. So I think that was a indication that that was an effective ideological tool for bringing about some change. I also proposed in '81 that we start the resource library, the Peace Resource Library. And we had modeled that on comments that or conversation I had with Bishop Tutu when he was here in the United States that year. And so he was telling me about the role that such libraries played in the struggle in South Africa for the African Congress. So that seemed interesting to me, and that it might have something to offer here. So I proposed it, and the board bought it, and that's when the Peace with Justice priority was established as a result of that action.
So at that point, the co-op is around
Mm-hmm.
and functioning. The UCF stuff is pretty much is all done at this point. The Neighborhood Watch is over
going.
or still going?
Neighborhood Service Ministry continued up until '83.
To 83, okay. Radical readings were happening. What were they called at that point? Was that
Radical readings.
Radical?
That's what
Okay.
they were called.
Radical readings. Okay.
So that was kind of, on that front, doing some educational or cultural action stuff. I had begun attending the PACA meetings.
People's Alliance on Central America.
Yeah. Because, the food co-op was a strong advocate, or support structure at this point. And there were quite a few PACA folk who were members of the food co-op. So that was some cross-fertilization going on.
Like Scott Peters or?
No, I don't think Scott was in at that part. He came in a little bit later. Yeah, he was about a year or two later, I would guess. So I started going to the PACA meetings because that seemed like a resource. And Eric Dell, who was the campus pastor over at the Community United Church, was also a member of the food co-op, and his brother Dan Dell, was one of the National Sanctuary organizers. And so Eric and I had been sharing ideas about trying to get something going with regard to Central America. And his brother Dan was urging us on. So we decided together on a trip to Arthur to pick up cheese for the food co-op that we would try to get a group of folk together who would be interested in talking at least about starting a public sanctuary site for Salvadorans and Guatemalans here. I forget the dates, but I think that was like in August or early September when we had that conversation. And we agreed that we'd meet back together in October to see where we were. And in that time, we had made contact with all the clergy in town, inviting them to a meeting in November. I'd also talked to Steve Lodwig, who was a member of IDF, but also a member of PACA.
And the church mouse.
And the church mouse. To see if PACA would be interested in this, and so yeah, he was, but he wanted to hear what the clergy had to say. Well, Eric and I got together again in October, and there was some interest, but not real gung-ho interest. Steve offered us the access through PACA, a meeting room in the Illini Union for a meeting in December. If we could get these people who seemed to be interested to make a commitment to attend that meeting. So we tried that, and the three clergy showed up, Father Tom Royer, Eric, and myself. None of the others. There were like probably 100 to 200 people we had invited to it. So, interestingly enough, Steve was not disappointed by that. He in fact sort of anticipated it, I think. So he was way ahead of us in terms of evaluating the clergy status in town. So he urged us to keep on going, and Father Royer said, okay, let's use St. Mary's and see if we can get some folks. So we had another meeting in January, another one in February, March, April, May, and the group grew to about 30 folk, both clergy, nuns, and some Roman laity, and some lay folk from other congregations. But we weren't getting anywhere, we were just talking around the issue. So I proposed that we all go back to our separate units, struggle for a commitment by the end of August. We meet in early September with what we found out.
This is 1983 right now, correct?
Fall of 82, yeah, 83. Fall of 83, move into 80, no, fall of 82, 83. So in our meetings here, we had University Place Church's staff, its church and society, members of its department, and about half of the board, IDF board, attending these meetings. And gradually, it seemed like we were ready to make a decision, so we planned a 3-day retreat, which would be held in the chapel, in which all members of the board would be present for a very intensive ideological discussion of the issues. And we brought in refugees, national organizers, people from the border, some folk from Mexico, and others like Belden Fields and some other pocket people. And it was a very intense discussion, but everybody was in favor of moving to the next phase, which was an IDF board meeting to make a decision. So that got set up in September. And first decision was that whatever decision we would make had to be unanimous. So it took us 3 days, not continuous days, but 8 hours over the 3 days, to reach a decision, and it was finally unanimous. We had one board member resign right after that because her husband ran a construction company and received federal money, and she was afraid that her connection to that sanctuary would affect his federal money. So she removed herself. It didn't seem like that was a conflict of interest for her personally, but it was a family conflict of interest, so she removed herself. We got back together with all of the other folk, and no one had made any moves whatsoever, the other churches. Part of the board's decision was we would offer the building as the site for public sanctuary, provided that there were two other groups that would join us in being sponsors. Community church came on next. Then I think it was the Friends, and then McKinley, and then St. Mary's. St. Mary's was the last because they had three political processes that they had to go through before they could arrive at a consensus. So it took them longer than the rest of us, but they agreed in January of '84.
Can you tell us how many, I guess, units were represented when the discussion started?
You mean churches?
Yeah.
Church units? I really don't remember, but I would guess 20. It seemed like quite a few. Most of them were like the Church of the Brethren. The Church of the Brethren was one. The Mennonite Church was one.
And why did they not come on board? It was because they couldn't get their couldn't get their parishioners to support it, or
They just never showed up to report. The two New Covenant Fellowship congregations. I don't remember.
Campus Crusade for Christ.
No, they never showed up. St. Pat's was one. A couple of Lutheran churches.
Newman.
No. Although I tried to get Father Newman Duncan to show up, but that was a funny experience. But there were quite a few at the beginning who were interested. The first meeting was down in Weisgarver, and it was, there was probably 75 people there. But it boiled down to 5. Well, in January, the national gathering was called. Tucson arranged for that, so that's when Frankie and I went down, Frankie Day. And I've already told you that story.
Mm-hmm.
So we came back and reported what was going on. We had made contact already with our attorneys who said they would serve us. They met with us. There was a large meeting held in what is now the PRC room, and there was a standing room only in that room. It was a bad room to hold it, and we should have held it in Weisgarver. But we weren't sure how many people would show up. A whole bunch did. And the lawyers wanted us to, the 5 co-sponsoring units, to create a chain of command, so that if anyone, their view was that the leaders of those 5 co-sponsoring units would be the ones that the feds would hit. And so they wanted a line of command established so that they would know who they were to defend at what time.
Who were the lawyers?
Brian Savage, Betsy Wong, and the 2 McGraths. So we established a chain of command. I was top dog. Charlie Schweitzer was next.
From McKinley.
Frankie Day was next. Tom Royer was next. And Ron Beebe, I believe, was last.
So the idea was if as people
If I got knocked off,
hit, then they would just move down from it. Okay.
But that was information that only the attorneys had.
What if the attorneys got knocked off? What was their chain of command?
The one who probably would have actually acted would have been Brian. And what would have happened if he'd got knocked off, I don't know. The others were kind of wishy-washy, especially McGrath. They were always anxious for every I to be dotted and every T crossed. But they were good because they knew what I's needed to be dotted and what T's needed to be crossed. Brian wasn't so concerned about such matters. I think he
Piddly
was
things, you know.
I think he was hoping that we
Details.
would be arrested.
So you could videotape it.
Yeah, or whatever. But he was the most gung-ho. So then we had to get organized, and so we put out a call for monitors. We wanted 24-hour watch with 2 monitors for each 8-hour term. And then we had to fix the apartment upstairs, so we got that done. There was going to be need for medical attention, so we recruited some doctors. No hospital was available for servicing, so we had to use Francis Nelson's back door into Mercy Hospital, Provena now. Provena was, Mercy was open to Francis Nelson's staff, as long as they didn't know too much. And the doctors at at Francis Nelson wasn't willing to tell too much, so it worked out well. There were several dentists who were ready to help.
So David and Eva came in May
May.
of '84?
Yeah, May 13th. They actually arrived 3 days early, but no one knew that except I think Frankie and I.
And they had been out of El Salvador for a while and were in transit?
Yeah, she had been a social worker and working in some of the villages, and that put her in contact with the guerrilla movement. And so she was marked as a person who should be arrested, and somehow she found out about that, so she took off walking her way through El Salvador into Mexico and on up to Tucson, crossing the border.
With her husband or with?
No, they'd never met at that point.
Oh.
He was working for a government agency, an agricultural agency, and also working with farming rural community, and his father was kind of like a local judge in a small village, and was apparently had close ties to the FMLN, and had been arrested, and David had been arrested. David had been tortured, and I guess was headed for execution, but had been able to escape with the help of the head of the agricultural department that he was working for, who hid him out in his offices for a while until he could get a plane, and then flew David out to San Diego. In the meantime, Eva had made her way through the Sanctuary Network to San Francisco, as had David, and that's where they met and got married.
Now, at this point in the larger sanctuary movement, that was its infancy pretty much. So,
Yes.
so them hearing about this was something brand new. I mean, that their contacts were able to get them out was a new thing.
Yeah. Yeah, well, the national gathering was the first time that people came together to try to form a sanctuary movement.
So in the space of about 5 months, this all came together then?
Yeah, they only gave us 3 months to do it. So in April, late April, we first had to organize regions. And we divided the country up into 7 regions arbitrarily. Well, not totally arbitrary, because there were already way stations all around. For example, there was a big one in Chicago. There were lots of congregations in Chicago that were already housing Central American refugees. There are 2 kinds of refugees. There's first asylum refugees, which are political refugees, and then there are immigrants, economic immigrants. So we were dealing with asylum immigrants first, asylum immigrants.
No, when IDF became a public sanctuary, at that point, how many other public sanctuaries existed around the country?
We were the 105th one.
105. But that was all in the space of a year or two, that from
Yeah.
1 to 105
Yeah, the
happened?
first sanctuary started in '81 in Tucson. And by word of mouth, others began to develop. But the press was on, and this, like by the time we came online, there were close to 1 million undocumented Salvadorians alone in the network.
So 105, so at its peak, the sanctuary movement, how big did it get? So if IDF was 105.
There were a little over 500 public sanctuary sites. So, well, we got the 7 regions established, and that meant that those sanctuary units in those 7 regions had to meet. So that meant getting them together to meet, which was like pulling teeth, without Novocaine. And then we had to get them to elect representatives or people to participate in a national gathering. And we had to find funding so that all the refugees wanted to get together. So we had to find funding to get the refugees all together. And finally we got it all done. It was haphazard as all get out, but it got done.
So how did your job change once people were actually living here, and were you dealing with sanctuary related stuff 28 hours a day?
Pretty much. Because I was wearing 2 hats, head of the local unit and working with the national. Yeah, I was able to pretty much continue to maintain the food co-op for another 2 or 3 years, and relying heavily on its leadership, which had been very much committed. The food co-op, as soon as we voted for becoming a public sanctuary, the food co-op held a massive meeting, general meeting, and voted to be supportive of it and to provide all the food support stuff and a lot of the monitors for the refugees.
Wow, how times have changed.
So they were into it in a big way, but that was also...
Because the monitors were in what's now the PRC office, but it used
Right.
to be the food co-op office, then the food co-op Quakos office.
So, yeah, that's... Well, and the tension also showed up in Quakos. I probably overplayed, looking back on it, overplayed the chain of command too hard, because, for example, the Friends are very heavily into consensus stuff. And Dorothy and Frankie and one other woman, what was her name? She was a real weird one. Bobby was her first name, I don't remember.
Bobby Watson Woodard or Bobby Woodard?
She's a strange one.
Yeah, she's still around now.
So they had to reach consensus among themselves, and then they had to
Wait,
take
Bobby
it-
Trist?
Trist,
Yeah. I knew I'd get a rise out of Joe once I figured it out.
Yeah.
And then they had to go to the Friends meeting and get them to sort of agree, and they never could get them to agree.
Had Dorothy already been to the Philippines at this point and back?
Yeah,
versus-
yeah, she was a basket case herself, because she'd been in
I thought she
prison.
went later.
She went later too.
Oh, so this,
but
when I
this-
saw her leave, that was the second trip.
Yeah.
She was, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, she had been held, she had been captured and, like one evening watch, we took turns leading evening watch and.
That evening watch was.
Evening watch, it was, it served two purposes. One, it was to help nurture the core of Quakos in maintaining their commitment. In a theological way. We chose the.
It was separate from the monitoring. It wasn't
Right,
necessarily.
right. But anybody could come. I mean, it wasn't a private kind of thing. It wasn't exclusive. But it was held at 11 o'clock, the last canonical hour, and it would run until we all either passed out or
Every night?
every night. So usually it would run till around 3 o'clock in the morning. We were helped mightily by large bottles of wine. Anyway, it was Dorothy's turn to lead this, and she went into a catatonic state. She just folded up into a little ball, and we all waited for her to do something, but she didn't. And we just, everybody remained silent for probably about 20 minutes. And
It's a Quaker thing.
yeah, so finally, I said, well, let's move on and see what we can do. Maybe Dorothy will return, and in about an hour she did. So she was a basket case. It was about a year before. But we first tried to get therapy going for her, but no way. She was highly suspicious of therapists here in the country. So, but anyway, she was willing to meet with 2 or 3 of us, and we would spend maybe 2 or 3 hours every Saturday up in McBride Hall, just talking, whatever thing she wanted to talk about. And gradually she came out of it. Plus I got her to writing novels and poetry about her experience in the Philippines, which she was willing to do.
So the IDF was, I mean, since there were monitors here 24 hours a day, right? So things were pretty chaotic.
Well, no, it was working, it was orderly. We had crises. One of the first crises, I guess, that we had was we were in what's now the PRC room, and David was meeting with a small group of folk over something, and a black Ford escort pulled in and parked. He saw it and he bolted out of the room. And he just completely disappeared. We went all over the building looking for him. And at that time, there was nothing over there on the other side of the street except a big field full of high grass.
And strawberry fields eventually, if you went far
And
enough.
the strawberry fields far over. So I thought, well, he's not in the building, so I'll just start looking in the neighborhood. And I found him buried up in that high grass out in that field. And black Ford escorts were used by death squads in El Salvador, and that's what he saw when it pulled into the parking lot, and he bolted. There were times when he was able to get a job with a construction company, and the construction company owner found out that he was an undocumented person and refused to pay him, although insisting that he continue to work, or he would turn him in. So we had to go deal with that guy. We had some women who were related to McKinley who thought, well, we'll take advantage of this and get a free babysitter, so they were hiring Ava to be their babysitter and refusing to pay her. So we had to deal with that.
Were they both publicly speaking on it at this point, or was
Oh,
it
yeah.
mostly David?
Yeah,
It was-
no, they were both speaking. They would always speak with their masks on, because what we'd found out in other cases was when undocumented political asylum refugees spoke with it and became identified, then his or her family back in El Salvador or Guatemala would be arrested and maybe even disappeared. So David and Eva had been warned through the network to always wear their masks. That was a bit of a public problem because, especially with the News Gazette and reporters for the television stations, because they didn't want to deal with anybody who wore a mask. So,
not like Lone Ranger masks. They wore bandanas around.
well, yeah, I've got some pictures of it.
I think it was like the Illinois Times, one of those papers had a picture of the
Right.
two of you,
Right.
two of them and you,
Right.
and like in front of the IDF sign or something.
Right, that was like maybe 2 or 3 days after they got here. So there were those kinds of crises. Then we had, Ava was pregnant, and then we had to deal with we got them into St. Mary's through Francis Nelson. The baby was born, but then how do you get a baby registered in the courthouse without having the parents identified? And so Brian was very helpful at manipulating those kinds of things. So
I don't think I realized that Brian was so involved at that point.
Well,
Was it through the nuclear free stuff that you guys knew about Brian, or how?
well, of course, that and the apartheid stuff.
Well, that apartheid stuff didn't.
Brian was involved.
No, I know he was, but I guess that was happening around the same time.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, all of this stuff was going on. This was a little bit before, but we had 2 big demonstrations against Reagan. Reagan appeared at Eureka College, and we pulled together a demonstration for that. And then he came from the Republican Party, and they had a big meeting out at the Round Bar.
I remember that.
Demonstration for that. So all of that was going on too. And later was the homeless thing, and we had that going on.
Well, I'm gonna do a sidebar like Joe did last time, trying to figure out where I was or where I came in the picture. So I came here in the fall of '84, and I had a Spanish class with Robin Cohen, if you remember her. I mean, I think she was a Paca Cuecos person, and she saw me as somebody to push. So I think that November or December I saw David speak at McKinley Church, and I got involved as a monitor. So I think by the beginning of '85, or maybe by the end of '84, I was doing a shift once a week in there. And I remember meeting a theological potpourri. It was like you, Kay Bridgeford, who was Unitarian at that point, and then Dorothy, who was a Quaker. So I met because Dorothy was often doing the overnight shift, and she would often relieve me because I was doing the evening shift. She slept there a lot in the office. We had a little fold-out couch thing. So that was my first encounter with the foundation, was sitting in that office. And then I think I joined the food co-op soon afterwards, even though I still lived in the dorms.
Yeah. And
the co-op didn't suck back then. On the record.
I think it's a three-drawer filing cabinet. Maybe it's 2-drawer. Last time I saw it was up in McBride, and it's one of those cardboard things, not a metal filing cabinet. But in that is all the old official Quaco stuff, and there's the monitor books.
But I remember it was a pretty organized thing, because there was a lot of people to get 24 hours a day, even though there was like a nighttime shift, but to get people to be in the office. And if something really had gone down, I'm not sure I would have been able to deal with it. I know there was the phone, they were supposed to call.
Yeah, there was the phone trade.
Where were the monitors at?
We just sat in where the PRC desk is now.
Oh,
Yeah,
We just sat at the desk, and in theory was that if the FBI came in through the front door so you could see them, and or if anything suspicious happened, that you were supposed to set off the phone tree and let people know, because the fear was, well, I mean, it was happening that sanctuary units were being busted. So this way, if they got, we found out anything that happened, we're supposed to initiate the phone tree, and
Well, the phone tree, there
Yep.
were 4 emergency teams. There were 2 places that refugees, undocumented refugees would be taken. One is to the federal courthouse in Danville at that time. There was no federal courthouse here. So they'd go to Danville or they would go to Chicago. So we had 2 teams. If the phone tree got initiated, those 4 teams would take off for their appointed places with the money necessarily to bail people out. Or bribe whoever they had to bribe to get them out. And they were to be there before the refugees got to those holding places. That
Yeah,
was
because probably once they were in the system, then
That's right.
you never know where they were.
And we had an agreement with People's Law Office in Chicago. They also were part of the country that they would be notified if they were to get to the office or the courthouse there in Chicago. And we had a lawyer, an attorney over in Danville also who was willing to do that. So that was one thing that kicked off. Another one was that each of the 5 co-sponsoring units had already recruited people from their separate units for a mass rally. They were to be here within 30 minutes of the initial call. And we would gather in the junction out there right in Springfield, stopping traffic, being arrested, whatever we had to do to draw public attention to what was going on.
I know PACA was really large at this point, and that's also the anti-apartheid movement was starting up. So there was a lot of activity, and I also remember the Pledge of Resistance,
Right.
which was kind of similar to that, which was people would sign, which would say if the U.S. invaded, was it just El Salvador or was it all of Central America? I can't
It was the
remember.
whole Central America. Nicaragua.
If the U.S.
Because
did an
Nicaragua was under pressure.
overt invasion, you agreed to do civil disobedience. Yeah, I think it was the whole region. So I remember signing the Pledge of Resistance outside Allen
Right.
Hall by
Right.
Greg Swenson, the guy
Yeah,
who did the
yeah, right.
Romero thing. He got me to
Right.
sign it, so I signed saying yes, I'll get arrested. if
And the goal was to have 5,000 people in the intersection.
Was that, just out of curiosity, Grenada had happened the fall before this, in '83, so this stuff wasn't in operation at that point, right? So there was no.
I don't think the Pledge of Resistance came till
The
after. I mean, the Pledge of Resistance
Yeah.
wasn't exactly.
It was a little later.
Yeah,
But it was.
Grenada was a surprise for, I mean, I was back in this country at that point. But, Grenada, nobody really expected that
Right.
to happen.
And nobody really protested
Took
it
people
too
off.
largely
Yeah,
because
took
it wasn't.
The Pledge of Resistance, as I remember it, was really started by Sojourners, the Washington DC outfit. And it came on a little later. Christic Institute was in pretty early. They were the ones who were watchdogging Reagan in the Iran-Contra.
They were the Iran-Contra
connection.
people, right there.
And were the ones who broke that story.
Well, I remember
So
CISPAS
we were
being,
all interrelated in some way.
and CISPAS was huge. The Committee in Solidarity with
right,
People of
right,
El Salvador
right.
was national.
Right.
'Cause they were, and so PACA was part of that, though not solely
And
part
America's
of that.
Watch and Amnesty International, those were all bodies involved.
I mean, I guess just the thing that there was so much activity going on around Central America and solidarity stuff. That wasn't all just one thing.
Yeah. I forgot about Amnesty, and that's where we got Francis Boyle involved in civil resistance theory. And he was willing to play that role for us. So yeah, it was an interesting conglomeration coalition thing that was coming together, and there was no way to figure it out. You went with your gut and hoped that you didn't make too many mistakes.
I do remember the food co-op thing because like Dee Castillo was one of the big Quakos people, but she was also in the food co-op, and then Brenda and Nancy and all those people. Everybody seemed to be involved in all of this stuff, at least at that
Yeah.
point, from my impression.
And so IDF was the only place that was actually housing refugees, just in town, right? Okay.
And then Ava did the postcards, right?
Oh, she did lots of things. It was not just postcards. She did the postcards, yeah, but she also painted pictures and when you got hanging in the office.
Did you bring any of the postcards with you?
No, but I got.
We probably still
I got
have
some,
baggies of them somewhere in
I
there.
got a photograph of one of her paintings.
It was one of the fundraising things that Ava did was to raise money was these nice little beautiful postcards
Mhm.
that I remember we were all supposed to sell as part of our like fundraising activities.
activities.
I think I had a stack of them that I never sold.
And we raised quite a lot of money with it. I've still got some, and I still use them at Christmas time. Well, anyway,
What was
that
the,
talking?
so you've got the refugees here. What was the immediate response, in the community when this became public?
Well,
I mean, churches as well as outside.
Right,
I mean, just
right.
generally.
And shortly after Frank and I got back from Tucson in January of '84, the editor of the News Gazoo called and wanted to get together. It was a woman, and I knew her for a number of years, and she had been pretty helpful in reporting things and covering events. But she wanted to talk, and usually it was me calling her, but this time she called me. Some big meeting had occurred in Chicago in which all the publishers of newspapers in the state of Illinois had been held, and owners had insisted that no coverage of the sanctuary movement take place. And so she had come to tell me that that was the policy of the News Gazoo. So that was the first reaction.
DI covered stuff though.
DI did, yeah. But the DI was not under its present control factors. So it was free to do whatever it wanted to do, and it did a fairly decent job.
They used to have reporters back then.
Yeah, they did. The next response was from Uniplace, and also over at McKinley Church. McKinley Foundation and McKinley Church were two separate entities at that time. And also at Community United Church. The foundation there and the church were two separate things. And Ron Beebe, who was the pastor at that point, he had apparently signed UCC on as a co-sponsoring without processing it properly in the congregation.
Wasn't that one of the mandates though that?
Well, yes,
down?
but he didn't do it, or at least that was the story. And he was booted out after about a year. Now, before we had gone into our own decision about it, the staff of Uniplace and their church and society people had all participated in this ideological thing we had done early. And they were gung-ho for it. And they presented a resolution to the congregation and a series of educational programs every month.
They were gung-ho, why? Because they didn't understand it?
Largely because everybody who was on that committee was also on the IDEA board.
Okay.
And also, well, the fact is that almost every key person in the church structure was a member of the IDEA board. At that time, we had infiltrated the decision-making structures pretty well.
As opposed to them infiltrating you.
Right. But then the real power structure began to function inside Uniplace, and this was composed of presidents and vice presidents of local banks and loan companies, and real estate people.
And this
insurance.
is after the reality of what was really
Right,
happening
right.
then. It was no longer discussion.
And so they began to play their role pretty much, I think, behind the scenes. So that when the congregation finally voted in May of '84. There were 3 votes. One was to denounce the sanctuary movement. 2 was to denounce the foundation. And the third was, since the 1908 conspiracy law, is that right? Early part of the last century. Anyway.
Sedition.
The treasurer of the board, church board, remembered the conspiracy law whenever it was passed.
Yeah.
It had to be in the early part of the 1900s, as a part of World War I.
Oh, the 1917.
1917,
Yeah, the
okay.
Sedition Act, yeah.
So he remembered that and brought it up, and he says, you know, we're even having this discussion, we're breaking that federal law. So I move that we expunge this, all record of this discussion.
This was right before David and Ava came?
Yes, about
Okay.
1 week before. So that was their third vote. So what shows up in their minutes is that the Church and Society Department presented their report, and the report was received.
So there's no record?
No record.
So,
I was wondering if somebody now wanted to sort of talk with some of the people involved in that discussion, are there any around that you know?
The moderator, the person who was moderator, Amaker, Mrs. Amaker.
Joanne? Joanne?
Joanne.
Was Clyde in multiple, was he in both positions at that point, or was he not as high in the church at that point?
Clyde had been surfaced as a communist back in the 60s, because he had headed up the local organizing for the teachers union at Central High School. And at one church board meeting, I forget what, the issue was Project Equality. We were dealing with anti-racism possibilities. And, one of the church board people said, well, we got to remember, Clyde was presenting the resolution for Project Equality. And one of the board members said, well, we got to remember that Clyde is one of the organizers of the local teachers union, and we know what they are. They won't even allow anybody to pledge allegiance in the classroom because they're communists.
Either Clyde's changed a lot, or they were really off base.
Well,
I'm guessing that they were off base.
They were off base. I don't know if Clyde's position has changed or not, but it came as a real surprise to Clyde to be called out like that. I remember he was really devastated by that. Where were we?
Now, was he a part of this?
No, because I was asking, because
Yeah.
Martine asked who was part of the power structure that made.
Yeah,
some
Clyde
of this-
was a part of that board meeting.
Part of the church board meeting?
Church board meeting.
Okay.
He was also on the foundation board, which also made him suspect. Who else was here? Catherine Wright would have been here, but she I don't think is longer. She lives out in Homer someplace, so I don't think she's even active anymore. Most of the people who were on our side left Uni Place shortly, about the same time I did. It could have been 85 or 86.
So I guess that leads us to the big fallout.
With the congregation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so the first step was this vote that they took.
Oh, yeah.
And then,
Well, at that time, the congregation had all of its Sunday school classes up on the foundation third floor that were below the middle school level. And the next thing we knew was that all of those classes on a Sunday morning disappeared.
well, that's probably a good thing. That probably wasn't very secure, was it? I wouldn't trust those little fuckers.
Probably not. But they all disappeared. And so
Whoops.
I went to church authorities
Strike
and said,
that.
you know what's going on? There's nothing going on. There's no nobody up there. And the refugees had befriended some people as they were going to class, some little kids or whatever. So they were wondering too, was being up there on the third floor all by your lonesome isn't pleasant either.
So the church mouse was still there. Steve was still there.
You know, Steve left, he graduated in
What was it?
May of
Was it
84.
Morgan? Paul Morgan was
Paul
that?
Morgan was next.
But so he was living there, and then they had an apartment that was in the front over, but it was larger than any of the small rooms because we
Right.
divided those rooms up, right? So they had.
And basically 2 rooms plus the kitchen. So what we found out was that Sandy Moyer, who is the staff person at UPCC in charge of Christian education, told me that the parents of those children didn't wish their kids to be associated with those refugees. So they had moved the classes out.
And this was within a few months of them living up there?
Yeah, it was almost, Sunday schools started in those days in September, so I would guess that probably by October it was vacated.
Can you hold that thought for a minute, Jim?
Sure. Might take a little break.